Please go ahead, Ambassador, and the event is being recorded for all panelists to know. Thank you.
Very good. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining this webinar on implementing SDG 14 with the Communities of Ocean Action. It's the first webinar of our series in 2021 on keeping the momentum for ocean action. My name is Peter Thomson, and I'm the United Nations Secretary General's Special Envoy for the Ocean. And my office, together with the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs, has organized this event. Our program will begin with an opening segment in which we shall be addressed by 4 distinguished speakers with mandated responsibilities for the UN Ocean Conference to be held next year in Lisbon. This will be followed by a keynote address by Dr. Mario Veros on her report, An Assessment of the Impacts of the United Nations Ocean Conference of Voluntary Commitments, and a panel discussion thereafter, which I will have the honor of moderating. So, to give me a second, I will bring up my remarks, which I'm going to give before introducing that distinguished panel. So, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, in his State of the Planet address, delivered at Columbia University in New York last December, United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres said that humanity is waging a suicidal war upon nature. A year earlier, at the climate COP in Madrid, he had warned that 3 major reports of the IPCC confirm we are knowingly destroying the life support systems of our planet. We have to ask ourselves whether we have sufficiently accepted the reality of that message and whether we're making the necessary transformations and preparations with the speed required. In the midst of the message, we're confronted by a looming predicament, one I describe by linking the fate of coral to that of humans. The IPCC has confirmed with a high degree of certainty that 99% of coral reefs will be dead when we go through the dreaded level of 2 degrees Celsius. At this point, remember, we cannot have a healthy planet without a healthy ocean, and corals are vital to a healthy ocean. Our great predicament is that we're not heading to a destination of 2 degrees. On the current path of carbon dioxide emissions, we're heading to a temperature increase of 3 to 5 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. That's a direct quote from the head of WMO. And that, if we continue on this misguided path, is a world on fire. And as a loving grandfather, I refuse that future for my grandchildren. I hope you believe in the dictum, act as if what you do makes a difference. It does. End of quote. That is my lodestar of hope. None of us should imagine that we're powerless. There's so much that has to be done as members of families and companies and communities and countries. So many choices to be made to secure the common good. So many transformations necessary to get us to the haven of a net zero world by 2050. And so with every day that passes, the question has to be, what am I doing today to help us reach the haven? Ladies and gentlemen, in the Secretary General's State of the Planet speech, he also stressed the need to, quote, deal with direct climate action, but simultaneously protect the ocean and protect biodiversity. And more recently, I heard the US Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, Senator John Kerry, say, for far too long, an ocean meeting was an ocean meeting and a climate negotiation was just that, a climate negotiation, without people recognizing the interconnectedness and the majesty of the ecosystem. So we need to say goodbye to silos. When you're meeting about the ocean, you are meeting about the climate. And of course, vice versa applies. Ladies and gentlemen, we're on the virtual road to Kunming, Glasgow, and Lisbon. And if we meet silos in the course of that journey, they must be confronted. If in spite of best efforts their doors remain closed, we'll just have to walk around them and continue along the direct path to our common destination, which is that of a net zero world by 2050. At this late stage, we no longer have the luxury of time. We must press on, and if we manage to finesse the connectivity between climate change and biodiversity and the decline of the ocean's health, we may find in our hands the key that unlocks the solutions to our great predicament. Ladies and gentlemen, as I said in a speech a few days ago during the Monaco Ocean Week, there is every reason to draw confidence from the exponential accumulation and open sharing of the knowledge we will acquire from the UN Decade of Ocean Science. We can see from IOC UNESCO's implementation plan for the decade that this is no straw horse. It is already apparent that the decade will be the great leap forward, long demanded in our understanding of the ocean's properties. The positive implications of equitable sharing of this accumulating scientific knowledge of the ocean could prove to be the existential bedrock of humanity's future. From renewable energy to carbon sequestration, from sustainable blue foods to new medicines in the wake of the declining antibiotic age, we look with hope and determination to the findings of the UN Decade of Ocean Science. I say again to everyone, get involved in this momentous collaboration. There is one ocean and it is our future. Ladies and gentlemen, may I take you back to the approach to 2015 and the negotiations leading to the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. Plastic pollution was massing on tide lines. Overfishing and illegal fishing were on the rise. Coral reefs were bleaching and dying. Mangroves disappearing. Sea levels rising. The evidence was in front of our eyes, but let's not forget what an uphill battle it was to bring SDG 14 into existence. Then came the 2017 UN conference to support SDG 14's implementation, when the world's ocean activists, from academia to NGOs, from youth representatives to the business world, joined with member states in New York at the UN in a show of global concern. That proved to be a turning point in the world's attention to the ocean's problems. Out of the 2017 conference came the Voluntary Commitments, initiatives from around the world aimed at implementing aspects of SDG 14. These now number well over 1,600, and we're having a good look at them today, courtesy of the report commissioned by UN DESA, Assessment of the Impacts of the United Nations Ocean Conference Voluntary Commitments. Between now and during the UN conference in Lisbon next year, these commitments will grow in number and content. It is therefore timely that we learn from their experience to date before elevating to the next stage. In all of this work, the communities of ocean action formed after the first UN conference to shepherd the voluntary commitments have played and will continue to play a key role. It's therefore a pleasure to welcome many of the co-focal points of the communities of ocean action as speakers and panelists today. I greatly look forward to hearing from them over the next 90 minutes, and I thank you for your attention to these opening remarks. It's now my pleasure to invite my distinguished colleague, His Excellency Ambassador Francisco Duarte Lopes, Permanent Representative of Portugal, to address us. You have the floor, Your Excellency.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Peter Thomson. First of all, let me thank all our colleagues at DESA for organizing this webinar and for keeping the momentum for ocean action. It is really a true pleasure to be here with you in this opening panel alongside yourself, Special Envoy Thomson, Ambassador Kimani, USG Zhenmin, and USG Serpa Soares. Let me also commend the representatives of the communities of ocean action for their hard work in support of the implementation of Goal 14. As you know, Portugal was one of the countries that pushed for a standalone goal on the ocean in the 2030 agenda back in 2015, thus highlighting the ocean's role as a keystone supporting the arch of sustainable development. One of the main elements of the 2030 agenda was the adoption of tangible, universally agreed targets. That is, the recognition that the implementation of the SDG and their targets depends on actions being carried to that effect, not only by states, but also by a constellation of non-state actors. It was therefore no coincidence that when setting up the UN Ocean Conference in 2017, member states, and particularly the of the first UN conference, Fiji and Sweden, decided to make the implementation of important core commitments to be complete, measurable actions made by different kinds of stakeholders. Around 1,400 voluntary commitments were made at the 2007 conference, thus creating the need, but also the opportunity to set up a platform to follow up on those commitments, generate new ones, and new ones were generated, and facilitate cooperation amongst different actors. As you are all aware, the response to this specific need was carried out through the launching of 9 thematic stakeholder communities of ocean action that have been working tirelessly since their establishment. As we look forward to holding the second UN Ocean Conference in 2022, I would like to make 3 brief points about the communities of ocean action, particularly in the context of our preparation for this conference. First, Kenya and Portugal want the second UN Ocean Conference to bring added value to the implementation of Goal 14 by, amongst other things, delivering on tangible, scalable, innovative solutions that put us on the right track in terms of conserving and sustainably using our ocean. We believe the communities of ocean action can play a key role in energizing and mobilizing different actors so that those solutions are featured at the conference, including, when necessary, in the form of new voluntary commitments. Second, the conference will continue to focus on building diversified and effective partnerships, offering a common framework within which different stakeholders can come together and work together with a common goal, making the best out of their different strengths and abilities. Building on their experience in networking and cooperation, the communities of ocean action will help us identify opportunities for such partnerships. And third, as an established network of relevant ocean actors, the communities constitute an important reservoir of knowledge and experience that the co-hosts of the conference will be happy to tap into when resuming preparations for the conference. Before closing, let me say that although COVID-19 pandemic led to the postponement of the major environment-related events, including the UN Ocean Conference, it has not postponed either the challenges we are facing nor our resolve to find the necessary solutions. It is precisely that spirit we want to carry over into the preparations of the second UN Ocean Conference, with a view to delivering a transformative event for the ocean and for the planet. Thank you very much.
Can you give me a thumbs up, Francisco, if you can hear me? Am I on mute? A thumbs up. Good. Thank you. Look, thank you very much for that, Ambassador. And I do share with you the solutions comment that you've just made there. I mean, the time that extra time that has been given to us is time to find more solutions. And I know that that is happening from what I'm hearing around the world. Ladies and gentlemen, as you know, the government of Kenya is co-hosting with Portugal the 2022 UN Ocean Conference. And it's now my great pleasure to give the floor to the permanent representative of Kenya at the United Nations, Ambassador Martin Kimani. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Thank you, Ambassador Peter Thomson, for organizing this meeting as part of keeping the momentum going for ocean action and for the leadership you've been showing throughout this process. We welcome as Kenya this opportunity for continuous assessment of the voluntary commitments to advance implementation of Sustainable Development Goal 14, particularly in the wake of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic that has also necessitated the postponement of the second UN Ocean Conference. Virtually all sectors of the economy for all our countries have been adversely affected. Jobs in sectors in the ocean economy, and already vulnerable coastal communities in Africa and other developing countries have been hard hit with significant revenue losses across coastal and marine tourism, fisheries and aquaculture, and the shipping industry, of course. These impacts flow beyond the ocean-based sectors to land-based economies, having economic and social repercussions across entire economies. Colleagues, as our focus shifts to recovery efforts aimed at building back better, it is also critical to build a resilient recovery. In Kenya, we have prioritized the sustainable utilization of our ocean resources as an enabler of our Vision 2030 development blueprint, which is intended to lift Kenya higher within middle-income countries in terms of income. Some of the efforts include ongoing fishing port project, training of fishermen, the Bandari Maritime Academy as a center of excellence, and the Kenya Coast Guard Service. We are further implementing policies aimed at tackling the challenge of ocean pollution, especially from plastic waste, through implementation of a ban on single-use plastics in all protected areas, including beaches, national parks, conservation parks, and forests, and working with local communities to conserve coastal ecosystems. In 2018, Kenya was proud to host the first global conference on sustainable blue economy that provided a platform for action-oriented commitments that focus on the productivity and sustainability aspects of the blue economy. Looking forward, as co-host of the second Ocean Conference in 2022, we will be incorporating sustainable blue economy investment to accord the opportunity for innovators, investors, scientists, government representatives, and the like to forge meaningful partnerships for the achievement of SDG 14. As I conclude, we must be cognizant of the reality that SDG 14 cannot be achieved in isolation. It requires deliberate international coordination and collaboration with the investment programs of other related SDGs and their targets, including food security and nutrition, climate action, biodiversity, to name just a few. We must now ensure that we all have the right tools and resources to effectively contribute to the sustainable management and use of our ocean resources. I look forward to the fruitful panel discussions that will follow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and thank you for reminding us about the Sustainable Blue Economy Conference held in Nairobi in 2018. And I know that Kenya, together with Portugal, are organizing special events on the Sustainable Blue Economy at the Lisbon Conference. So thank you for that. I'd like to move now to introduction of Liu Zhenmin, who is the UN Under-Secretary General for Economic and Social Affairs. So Mr. Liu has been designated by the UN as the Secretary General of the UN Ocean Conference in Lisbon, in which role he serves as the focal point within the UN Secretariat for the organization of the conference. He will also speak on behalf of the communities of ocean action of the Sustainable Blue Economy today. The floor is yours, Under-Secretary General.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Ambassador Thomson. Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. DESA has been very honored to co-host this event jointly with the Office of a Special Envoy for Oceans. I thank Ambassador Thomson for moderating this meeting. I also thank Ambassador Lopes, Ambassador Kimani, and my colleague, my friend Miguel Soares for the opening, dear colleagues, let me welcome all of you to this webinar today. The past year, we have grappled with a devastating global pandemic, economic contraction, widening inequalities, rising hunger, and a triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, and ocean degradation. As noted by the UN Secretary General, we need renewed, strengthened, and inclusive multilateralism to respond to these challenges and recover better together. Indeed, our collective response will determine humankind's future. We therefore begin this year's Keeping the Momentum for Ocean Action webinar series with the communities of ocean action. They have been rallying important stakeholders to our common goal of implementing SDG 14 through voluntary commitments. The voluntary commitments were one of the major outcomes and vital legacy of the 2017 Ocean Conference, as Ambassador Thomson just elaborated. Today, the voluntary commitments were one of the major outcomes. To date, there are 1,642 registered voluntary commitments from member states. This is a very good number. These groundbreaking commitments cover an array of ocean action encompassing all the targets of SDG 14 and their interlinkages with other SDGs. Dr. Marjo Vieras has worked with DESA to provide a full analysis of the impacts, gaps identified, and solutions that can be scaled up. This is reflected in a report entitled Assessment of Impacts of the United Nations Ocean Conference Voluntary Commitments. I'm so glad to be Dr. Marjo Vieras will be our panelist for today's event. Along with Secretary General Special Envoy for the Oceans, I'm happy to announce to launch the report here today. You will hear from Dr. Vieras later during the panel discussion about the key findings of the report. I would also like to thank the government of Sweden for its generous contribution, which made the production of this report possible. Ladies and gentlemen, the COVID-19 pandemic is a wake-up call to make peace with nature. The ocean not only plays a critical role in poverty reduction, food security, health, jobs, and social inclusion and equity. It also holds the key to success of tackling climate change and restoring biodiversity as a giant sink of carbon dioxide and home to millions of species. Therefore, it is our responsibility to make sure the ocean is placed front and center in the global recovery efforts. Notwithstanding some progress in increasing marine protected areas, the world is alarmingly off track to implement SDG 14. We have already missed the 2020 deadline for targets 14.2, 14.4, 14.5, and 14.6. It means that we are already left behind, lagged behind. Moreover, due to the pandemic, our efforts to save the ocean will very likely be met with the competing demands for resources between economic, social response measures, and environmental protection. Ladies and gentlemen, a sustainable blue economy offers a vision for countries' efforts to recover better from COVID-19 by bringing economic and environmental priorities together. The ocean is seen as the next great economic frontier. Its contribution to the global economy was projected to double from $1.5 trillion in 2010 to $3 trillion by 2030. As a core focal point for the community of ocean action and sustainable blue economy, I'm happy to note that the interest in this area is well illustrated in the registry of voluntary commitments. Sustainable blue economy also provides a much needed solution for small island developing states, the SEEDs, and the least developed countries, the LDCs. It brings economic benefits and jobs while safeguarding marine ecosystems and protecting the ocean. Social equity is often seen as a forgotten dimension of the transition to a sustainable blue economy. We must ensure that in a competitive ocean space, the interests of the most vulnerable are not left behind. Preliminary analysis shows that pursuing a blue economy requires access to affordable long-term financing at scale. The challenges faced by voluntary commitment holders demonstrate that such finance can be difficult to come by. Lack of capacity and access to technology also remain major challenge. Transfer of marine technology is crucial to ensure that no one is left behind. Dear colleagues, looking ahead, immense potential lies in some underutilized sectors of sustainable blue economy, such as ocean renewable energy, marine biotechnology, and alga aquaculture. If further developed, these sectors will generate robust employment increases and profits while helping to combat climate change. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we must take urgent action to save our ocean from pollution, overfishing, acidification, and warming up. We must scale up science-based and innovative solutions to sustainably use marine resources and keep ocean-based economy vibrant. Let us meet in Lisbon with solidarity, strong commitment, and transformative measures to secure a world with a healthy ocean for the generations to come. I wish this would be a great success. I thank you.
And we thank you, Undersecretary General Liu, for those wise words. And thank you in particular for emphasis on the most vulnerable. Our next speaker is Miguel de Serpa Soares, the Undersecretary General for Legal Affairs and UN Legal Counsel. Undersecretary General de Serpa Soares has been designated as the special advisor on ocean and legal matters to the co-presidents of the UN Ocean Conference. He's going to speak to us today in his capacity also as the co-focal point of the Community of Ocean Action on implementation of international law, as reflected in the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. You have the floor, Undersecretary General.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear Peter, dear co-panelists this morning, it is my pleasure to address this webinar, which I think provides us with a timely opportunity to reflect on the important role of the communities of ocean action. At the outset, I wish to note that I am speaking as a co-focal point for the community on implementation of international law as reflected in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, a role which I have the pleasure of performing together with Mr. Michael Lodge, the Secretary General of the International Seabed Authority. And I'm sure it will not come as a surprise that I will be talking about norms and laws and implementations. Now, there is quite a broad consensus that oceans and marine resources are essential to successfully tackle poverty eradication, ensure food security, and sustain economic growth, and of course, provide livelihoods and decent work. It is therefore essential to ensure that all actions be undertaken in a sustainable manner and with due consideration for the need to protect the environment and biodiversity. Now, one of the best ways to achieve this is to work towards an effective implementation of the legal framework for the oceans, which the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea at its core. And in fact, it is even a pivotal condition to deliver against the 2030 agenda, and in particular in relation to the targets of Sustainable Development Goal 14. So it is with this in mind that through the activities undertaken by our community, we have explored different but related pathways to improve the implementation of the convention and related instruments. And one area of focus has been addressing gaps relating to the lack of participation of many developing states in the decision-making processes and also in operational activities, such as marine scientific research. And moreover, the full and effective implementation of the convention requires the promulgation and implementation of national legislation, rules, regulations, and policy, which can pose a challenge to developing states, in particular least developed countries, landlocked developing countries, and small island developing states. Now, we have discussed different responses to address such challenges, including establishing trust funds, facilitating capacity building programs, and providing advice and assistance for an improved implementation of the convention in national legal systems. And as important as such initiatives are, we have observed that they are often confronted by the lack of sustainable financing. Building on this, a second area of focus consisted in discussing the specific challenges and needs which are posed to developing countries. And we noted in this regard that most of them faced similar situations, which call for innovative solutions to improve their human, technological, institutional, and systemic capacities. So devising new financing mechanisms aim at furthering the work undertaken by all relevant stakeholders to address such needs is also urgent. The third area requiring due consideration relates to the importance of strengthening ocean governance through enhanced cooperation and coordination. Now, to this end, it is somehow imperative to identify new partnerships. And the discussions on this specific point have been inspired by the General Assembly's repeated observation that the problems of ocean space are closely interrelated and need to be considered as a whole through an integrated, interdisciplinary, and intersectoral approach. And the General Assembly has also emphasized the need to improve cooperation and coordination at the national, regional, and global levels in accordance with the Convention to support and supplement the efforts of each state for implementation and observance of the Convention and the integrated management and sustainable development of the oceans and the seas. Now, it is essential to promote further the need to create concrete synergies, avoid duplications, and overlap of mandates and responsibilities between competent organizations. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, in view of these valuable discussions, we are convinced that all communities of ocean action and their members have an important contribution to make in the delivery of the Special Development Goal 14, particularly by raising awareness of the legal and policy framework for the oceans through which we can ensure an effective implementation of the Convention. Moving forward, it will be important to capitalize on linkages and avoid possible duplication of efforts by promoting exchange of information, cooperation, coordination between all the 9 communities. Member states and relevant international organizations are also called upon to play a major role by developing the capacity of states towards broader participation in an effective implementation of the Convention, its implementing agreements, and other ocean-related instruments, and also by undertaking activities to strengthen ocean governance. Now, these efforts are more than ever needed now in light of the ongoing and very real disruption of many ocean-related initiatives caused by COVID-19 pandemic and the need to build back better. So in the lead up to the postponed 2020 United Nations Ocean Conference, we wish to confirm our determination to continue to promote the effective implementation of international law as reflected in the Convention, on the basis of which it will be possible to ensure the conservation and sustainable use of the oceans and their resources for sustainable development. Finally, on a less serious vein, dear Peter, I really liked your literary expression, The Road to Lisbon. It sounds like a good novel. And I have to talk to my colleague, Mr. Liu. We definitely need to find a UN document to baptize The Road to Lisbon. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for that, Undersecretary General. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me? Good. I like the idea of your novel. I think it could probably be made into a movie, although there was a movie called the Night Train to Lisbon, I think, which was one made. But thank you for that. And thanks for the emphasis on partnership. As you well know, member states in their wisdom in mandating the Lisbon Conference have called for solutions and science and innovation, but they've also called for partnerships. So that's really important. Look, that concludes the opening segment of this event, and I'd really like to thank our four distinguished speakers. There are many calls on their time, and we really appreciate the fact that the four of you, were able to join with us. I'm now going to move to the next section, which is before the panelists begin. We're going to give half an hour to Dr. Mario Vieros. Mario is going to present the report which Undersecretary General Liu referred to and launched during his address. And I'm going to ask Dr. Mario Vieros to present her findings. But first, let me introduce her a bit. She's the director of a consultancy company called Coastal Policy and Humanities Research, which undertakes interdisciplinary research on ocean issues. She's also a senior fellow with the Global Ocean Forum, and previously she coordinated the Global Marine Governance Project at the United Nations University and the work on marine and coastal biodiversity at the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity. Dr. Vieros is also was the person who conducted the first voluntary commitment assessment that was done after the 2017 Ocean Conference on commission by DESA. Today, she's going to present her findings reflected in the report, and I repeat the report's title, An Assessment of Impacts of the UN Ocean Conference Voluntary Commitments, which was launched, as I say, just now by the Undersecretary General. This report was commissioned by UNDESA and was made possible by a generous contribution from the government of Sweden towards the substantive follow-up of the 2017 UN Ocean Conference. So the floor is yours, Dr. Vieros. You have 30 minutes of our time. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Ambassador. And it really is my pleasure to be here today to talk about this new assessment of the impacts of the voluntary commitments from the UN Ocean Conference. And what I'd like to do is just give a brief overview of the results of the assessment and then draw some lessons learned from it as well for going forward. And just noting that there is a lot more detail in this assessment, including in some examples of individual commitments. Next slide, please. Yes, thank you very much. As we all know, the voluntary commitments were one of the key outcomes from the 2017 UN Ocean Conference. And they were really what I would call a triumph of inclusivity. They were open to all stakeholders. They were tremendously popular. And they garnered all different types of commitments from the local level to the global, and some very innovative solutions that could be scaled up going forward. We started at about 1,400 commitments initially, and now that I checked just yesterday, there were 1,642 commitments in the registry, so they're still being added to. And they still get continued interest from a number of different entities, UN entities, IGOs, NGOs, civil society, academia, scientific community, private sector, philanthropic organizations, other relevant actors and partnerships. So really very broad segment of interests and groupings. So the question that we asked in this report then is that now that we're more than 3 years later, almost 4 years later soon, what has been the impact of these voluntary commitments in advancing progress towards Goal 14 and its targets? And given that it has been quite a different year in the last year with COVID, this also has had an impact on what we're seeing. Next slide, please. So just a little bit on the nitty-gritties on how we went about assessing impact. And the primary source material for the progress report submitted by the voluntary commitment holders that technically should be submitted every year, as well as a questionnaire circulated by the United Nations with more specific questions. There are also a number of supplementary materials that we relied on, project websites, international databases like the World Database on Protected Areas, for example, reports, newsletters, evaluations, and other materials as well. And also the very valuable work done by the communities of Ocean Action and the reports that they have produced. Next slide, please. So one of the difficulties that was encountered right away was that the level of reporting in the registry is still quite low. And this is not unusual for commitments of this kind. But with a 24% overall reporting rate, it was very difficult to make quantitative assessments about progress in many cases. So the assessment is a little bit more qualitative and anecdotal in some cases than I would have liked it to have been. So this is something certainly to work on. The highest reporting rates were with other relevant actors and UN entities, and the lowest with philanthropic organizations. But there were progress reports for all of the SDG 14 targets. Next slide, please. So let me just then go through each one of the targets and just say a few words about all of them. And starting with target 14.1, which is on marine pollution. And what we really saw here that was quite remarkable was a major shift in public perception regarding single-use plastics, marine litter, and microplastics. And it was also quite remarkable that there was this large degree of action by sort of grassroots organization, by community groups, by civil society, who organized and went out and did cleanups, education, organized awareness raising, toolkits for schools, toolkits for teachers. I mean, there was a lot of these types of actions. And while these might seem isolated, when I started adding up all the marine debris and trash that was collected from beaches and water column, I came up with a figure of 2.1 million kilograms, which is actually an underestimate, because not all of them reported on that particular measure, so it is likely much more. But it just goes to show that these single actions do add up to quite a lot. On the governmental level, there were bans on single-use plastics and restrictions, action plans, recycling, waste management actions. And those too had impacts that were reported, particularly in terms of reduction of trash in waterways and visual impacts. There were regional action plans and policies, private sector initiatives as well that were quite good. And in shipping, quite a few success stories of reducing ship-based pollutions and emissions. Some of these challenges that were encountered, measurability, financing, as with many commitments, and also regional global collaboration on marine litter. There's a need to go forward to address all aspects of the plastic supply chain, and global assistance and coordination is needed to provide a more coherent response, as well as perhaps further attention paid to other forms of pollution, such as nutrients and sewage. Next slide, please. Going on to 14.2, here it was a little bit more difficult to quantify, but there were considerable success stories and progress made in terms of ecosystem approach, marine spatial planning, and policies. Blue carbon projects and ecosystem restoration, which were still somewhat fringe some years back, are now becoming much more mainstream. And as well, a strong linkage here to climate change, climate adaptation, and building resilience. The challenges include lack of funding, again, and lack of awareness, capacity, and data comparability. But there's a lot of good solutions here that could be scaled up in the future. I should note that the component of Target 14.2 that relates to avoiding adverse impacts has not been well implemented, and this perhaps would call for more cumulative impact assessment and those kinds of action. This is also a target that came to term in 2020, so there's some thinking around how we go forward from here. Next slide, please. 14.3 in ocean acidification was really a success in networking of scientists around the globe and the creation of partnerships. And as I started counting how many organizations were involved, about 265 scientific and policy institutions participated globally in these networks. And this is probably, again, an underestimate and a number that is growing, but this is show you a little bit on the magnitude. The capacity of young scientists and female scientists was built, data was improved, low-cost monitoring tools made available. And there was also a response measures developed, including ocean acidification action plans. And that included things like habitat restoration, seagrasses, and their role in acidification, for example. Challenges included lack of resources, long-term sustainable funding for observations, a very common challenge, gaps in observations, and limited awareness about ocean acidification. Going forward, awareness raising and education, including among policymakers, is required, filling geographical gaps in observations and better understanding the adaptation aspects to ocean acidification. How do organisms actually adapt in the long run? Next slide, please. On 14.4 on sustainable fisheries, again, some very good examples on implementation. Volume of catch certified as sustainable has increased. There's examples on ecosystem approach to fisheries and governance measures that have been strengthened, improved information, seafood industry initiatives, work done on IUU fishing, including through the Sport States Measures Agreement, as well as improving monitoring and surveillance, as well as bycatch mitigation. Lack of capacity, again, is a challenge. Poor data, monitoring, control, and surveillance, and human rights issues in fisheries. Potential gaps in more needs to be done on a larger scale. Pre and post-harvest loss and waste is an issue still to be addressed, and additional efforts to transition to ecosystem-based fishery management. Next slide, please. Okay, and 14.5, conserving at least 10% of the oceans. This was one where there was considerable impact that could actually be documented. And when I started adding up all the MPAs that had been either expanded or newly established, it amounted to 3.3 million kilometers square, which is roughly the size of the country of India, and included commitments by governments, NGOs, funding agencies, and there really was an active amount of donor support here. But also what we saw was increased collaboration and networking between MPA sites, and also increased stewardship through local management of marine areas. It wasn't just the formal MPAs. However, challenges were also faced, and many MPAs lacked permanent funding for operating costs and management measures. The capacity for stakeholder engagement, consultation, and ownership was also something that takes some time to work through and was seen by as a challenge by some projects. Gaps still include ecological representativity, climate change considerations, management effectiveness, capacity building, and particularly long-term finance and monitoring the ecological and socioeconomic impacts of MPAs. Now, this is another target that came to term in 2020 and is actually very close to being reached at this point. And we believe that the CBD post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework will offer future direction on where this goes. Next slide, please. On harmful fisheries subsidies, target 14.6, I don't have so much to say at this moment, except that there has been progress in creating information and sharing that information, and that this is currently at the hands of WTO negotiators. This is also a target that expired in 2020. Next slide, please. 14.7, the so-called blue economy target on increasing economic benefits to SIDS and LDCs. The evaluation of target suffers a little bit from underreporting, because I know that there are many excellent initiatives out there and that there is progress being made in blue economy transitions in the countries that are reporting. There's also important models of innovative financing that could be scaled up that are really tremendously important. And there's sectoral progress in fisheries, agriculture, tourism has suffered from COVID quite a lot. So there are lots of efforts happening in many countries, but this is also perhaps a place where there's still a lot of work being done on trying to figure out national strategies and regional strategies towards the blue economy. Again, challenges sustainable financing, staff expertise, and also coordination among multiple stakeholders. In terms of potential gaps, there's certainly certain sectors that could increase participation here. Aquaculture, marine biotechnology, renewable energy, those are all new sectors that could benefit the blue economy. Next slide, please. 14A on scientific knowledge, capacity, and technology. Again, there's been quite a lot of progress made in global ocean observation and monitoring, new techniques of tracking migratory species, DNA-based techniques, and also networks, newer networks that focus more on interdisciplinary science and science policy interface. A large number of capacity development initiatives, as well as some technology transfer. Funding, again, is a challenge, as well as access to data, and also very fundamentally locating where that data might be residing. Gaps include socioeconomic information relating to the ocean, some undersurveyed regions of the ocean, species, as well as the deep sea, and capacity and technology gaps that require long-term partnerships, mentoring, and work to still address. Next slide, please. On 14.5, on small-scale artisanal fishers and their access to resources and markets, there's some very excellent commitments here, but also these are very localized, and so it's very difficult to say anything about the collective impacts. On the individual front, there's certainly been improvement in access to resources and participation in resource management, in particular in many cases, as well as max access to markets on the local scale. There are some small-scale artisanal fisheries that have been certified, which allows them to then access international markets. Capacity development has been done on a range of locally important topics, and this really is a very large range of topics and some excellent efforts there. And improvements to available information on a global scale have also been undertaken to better understand the role of small-scale fisheries globally. Challenges, there's the need to continuously strengthen fisher organizations, recognize traditional knowledge in fishing and the right to decent work. Certification, while advances have been made, still presents challenges to some small-scale fishers, as well as lack of data collection and scarcity data. And this is really a target that requires further action across a broad range of countries. Next slide, please. And finally, the very cross-cutting target of 14C, implementation of international law as reflected in UNCLOS. And there have been a lot of improvements in available information about UNCLOS and international law in general and the understanding of it. But I really wanted to highlight some of the progress that I thought was tremendous that has been made in cross-regional cooperation and governance, including between regional seas and regional fishery management organizations. Some of the really interesting models that have come from there that could be scaled up, as well as new regional action plans and regional collaborations of all sorts. So there's some very good examples here. Challenges, as always, in the ocean space is the sectoral and often fragmented nature of ocean governance and the complex nature of the administrative, political, and legal nature of the activities that take place in this ocean space. There's going forward very likely many stakeholders that will still require further assistance in better understanding and implementing UNCLOS, and also trying to scale up some of these good cross-sectoral governance examples and perhaps innovate new ones as well. Next slide, please. And while I went through target to target, most of the voluntary commitments are actually cross-cutting to many degrees, and including cross-cutting to other SDGs as well. And they have had a large collective impact all around in raising awareness about the ocean and the importance of the ocean. And these awareness-raising activities are particularly focused on youth, but also some of the sort of benefits of many of these commitments have been more tangible, things like provision of employment, including for women, benefits to marginalized groups, fishing communities, single mothers, indigenous peoples. So there's a very large number of these commitments that are really addressing the Agenda 2030 call to leave no one behind. Next slide, please. So if we then look at these collectively and some of the issues that jumped up at me and some of the lessons that came from the bright spots in these commitments. First of all, grassroots momentum is a very powerful thing, as could be seen in these, particularly in these commitments relating to marine pollution. There's many local initiatives that started small and they built momentum through social media, to church groups, through any means that they could, community groups. And they often started with minimal funding, relied on volunteers and donations, and then over time built up and collectively started to achieve considerable results. The second lesson I wanted to highlight is the importance of partnerships, and partnerships really are a key to success, as demonstrated in the commitments. And to expand initiatives and to make them more impactful will require partnerships. It requires partnerships that are meaningful, that are equal, and that build trust and over the long term. It's a step up from grassroots level of action, and they require development of a common vision and actions to achieve that vision. They often started smaller and have expanded their reach, and some of them include multiple countries or are global now. And they often include capacity development and mentoring relationships. Next slide, please. And thirdly, then expanding networks will help scale up successful initiatives. And we have seen many, many examples on this, particularly in the on the science and on the ocean acidifications and side. And these networks grow over time. They provide an opportunity to expand successful national initiatives, regional networks of MPAs. They offer new and creative solutions through interregional learning, South-South cooperation. And they also provide a way to address global problems on the global level. And however, this is not to say that local solutions are not important. They are often some of the most creative solutions, but it is also important to communicate these local solutions to a global audience. Fourthly, and this is something that COVID has really demonstrated, is that sustainable shock-proof funding is important for long-term impact. COVID has demonstrated the precariousness of funding for many marine conservation initiatives. Diverse, sustainable, and innovative long-term finance and solutions are now more important than ever with COVID. And there are some very good examples in the voluntary commitments on achieving sustainable long-term funding. Next slide, please. And this is my final slide, and I just wanted to say a few words in the moving forward in the report, where we should keep the inclusivity of the voluntary commitments, because this is something that has been very special about them, but also pride perhaps for some accountability. And these voluntary commitments have been a success in providing for inclusive participation of all ocean stakeholders from local to global levels, and this is very important. And there's also been new approaches that have been pioneered to keep the momentum going, such as the Community of Ocean Action, and that these also are very important and successful. And while these have achieved success, overall, we still have some lack of reporting that needs to be improved. And perhaps we could think about encouraging commitment holders to undertake simple monitoring with a baseline of agreed upon metrics. But having said that, I also realize that it's important not to discourage commitments, but to just provide for accountability for better assessment on the impacts. And also, as we move forward, we'll require targeted commitments to fill gaps and scale up those bright spots, those successful solutions. Next slide, please. And with that, I just wanted to say thank you very much.
Well, the thanks go to you, Dr. Veros. That's very comprehensive. I've done a few summings up recently on progress of SDG 14, and that's one of the best I've seen. So look, it gives us all food for thought, because obviously times change, and with the conference coming up in Lisbon next year, there are going to be people thinking, you know, what voluntary commitments can I make before the conference and at the conference? And your report will provide a really useful background into how to most meaningfully make a voluntary commitment and how to make it most helpful to the implementation of SDG 14. So thanks very much for that presentation. Food for thought for all of us in the weeks ahead, perhaps before we make our own voluntary commitments through our organizations. Look, we've now come to the panel discussion of today's event, during which we're going to be addressed by 7 distinguished panelists, all of whom will, in the first instance, address us for about 7 to 8 minutes. Representing 7 communities of ocean action, our panelists are going to present on the current overall status of implementation of voluntary commitments in their respective communities of ocean action and how they contributed to achieving the SDG 14 targets. They're going to look at what the main gaps and challenges are and what innovative and science-based solutions emerging from the voluntary commitments can be scaled up at global and national levels to address the common challenges in implementing SDG 14. I understand they've also been invited to share their thoughts and insights on how we can ensure that the crucial role of the ocean is recognized in the global recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. And most importantly, what action should be taken to make it happen. And then after they've spoken, we're going to hear from them further during the question and answer segment. So ladies and gentlemen, without further ado. Our first panelist is my esteemed colleague, Dr. Vladimir Ryabinin, who is the Executive Secretary of the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission of UNESCO, which, as you know, is based in Paris, and he's also Assistant Director General of UNESCO. He has been leading the work of implementation of the UN Decade of Ocean Science. And Vladimir will present on the implementation status and update on the progress of the Community of Ocean Action on scientific knowledge, research capacity development, and transfer of marine technology. Dr. Ryabinin, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Special Envoy, Ambassador Thomson, and really Your Excellency in everything that you do for the ocean. So thank you for having IOC delivering this little presentation. I would like to say that we work on the Community of Ocean Action #7, focusing on the scientific knowledge together with the Global Environment Facility. And you know, I would like also to refer to the wonderful presentation that we heard just before this, my little presentation, that I think to some extent confirms our own conclusions of where we are. But you see now the first slide of my presentation that I really hope that this is the case. And I would like to say that, you know, I remember several commitments that we made at the Ocean Conference. The first commitment was that we will be developing the concept of the Decade of Ocean Science, and we have the decade. We also promised to develop the ocean literacy approaches, and this is, I think, a mainstream activity that is happening around the world. We also promised to start developing maritime spatial planning, and this is an area which is now seen as very promising for management of the ocean. So we held to our commitments. We also tried to analyze how the whole set of commitments is moving forward. So there were around 600 voluntary commitments that were related to science, not only science, but there were some others. So, you know, the total of 1,400 different commitments was divided between several community of action, and some of them overlapped. So we sent a survey together with Global Environment Facility, received very small number of responses, unfortunately. And but I would like to say that those that responded, they confirmed that they communicate with internally with other members of this Community of Ocean Actions, and also they communicate and work on these commitments with external partners. So, and this is a pie chart that shows how they would estimate our help to them in terms of how we support this voluntary commitment. I would say that now there is some reservation, but in principle, our support to them was seen as partially useful. And also, I would like to say that these efforts that we undertake, so in terms of making the effort collective, I think also are partially successful. So, and overall, the assessment of experience is, I would say, 50-50. So, you know, there is probably need to help the voluntary commitment holders more with that. And I would like also to say that, but participation in this process, participation in the community helps to increase the impact of the voluntary commitment. This was agreed on the partial level by nearly, or well, more than 50% of the respondents. So this is, you know, to some extent, the statistics. You know, there is a little lies, there are big lies, and there is statistics. So we have to really understand the processes. And you know, and what we can do with the current situation. I think we really can engage them in publishing, developing narratives. You know, we can help them to increase the visibility. I would like to say that many of these holders of the voluntary commitment are very small organizations, so it will be very difficult for them to get the visibility that they deserve. So that is what we can always do. But I would like to draw your attention to the last conclusion from that assessment that we conducted together with Jeff. So that the platform that we have requires an analytical tool to identify gaps, report outcomes at the community of ocean action level, and also leverage the investment. So this, I think, what is may be achieved by integrating the work on the scientific voluntary commitments under the ocean conference process. So, and the decade, the ocean science that Peter Thomson introduced to you at the beginning of this web event may provide a service. That is very important, because you know we have a community of ocean action which is working as we saw. We also have a number of various science initiatives that are outside of these communities of voluntary commitment, but are also of high relevance for the Sustainable Development Goal 14 and the whole 2030 agenda. So that was a motivation for us to propose to United Nations, and that's what our, as I said, voluntary commitment, to propose the Decade of Ocean Science. And I would like to say that the implementation plan is not an IOC plan. It is the plan that is developed with a very inclusive process in which we had thousands of people, hundreds of organizations, I would say around 100 countries participating in this. And this plan is flexible, I would say, composition of niches in which we would like people to start working. So we already sent a request for actions, and we received around more than 200 different proposals. So we are packaging this now, working with these ideas. So this, in addition to community of ocean action, now we have the Decade of Ocean Science. And also, I would like to say there are also friends of ocean action. They also create certain coalitions, and some of them are also focusing on the science. So I think what is very important in science is the design or co-design. So everything has to be coherent and connected. And that's exactly what I think makes it promising to use the platform of the decade for moving forward with further voluntary commitments at the Ocean Conference. So I would like to say that when we look at the societal outcomes of the decade, which are shown here, these are qualities of the ocean: clean, healthy, resilient, productive, predictive, safe, accessible, inspiring, and engaging. You can easily see these are qualities not only of the ocean, but also of people in their relation to the ocean. But you know, this is my usual phrase when I introduce the societal outcomes. What is now less usual for me, that I see how intrinsically they are connected to the different targets of Sustainable Development Goal 14. We in the decade try to develop science that is helping really almost directly to achieve the targets of the decade. And we are going to do this with the whole community in the 10 domains that are called challenges, relating to pollution, relating to ecosystems, their management, relating to food, relating to ocean economy and climate nexus. And you can easily see targets of SDG 14 in the challenges. So basically, this is what I wanted to say, that the decade provides a platform for organizing the voluntary commitments, for giving them a home, for also inspiring thought about what can be done. So these two processes somehow need to converge. And also I would like to conclude my presentation by referring to the Global Ocean Science Report. This is a report published in 2020 that analyzes the capacity of ocean science in the world. So, and we see disparities. We saw them in the first report in 2017. And we would like to engage in moving forward in creating capacity, leaving no one behind. So please just remember that there is this report. There are some key findings that help formulating the decade and moving ocean science forward. And I would like also to say that in extension to this report, we very likely, I think, we embark on the assessment of the impact of the COVID on the funding for ocean science and the state of ocean science. We already know that there were significant issues related to ocean observations, to tsunami warning systems and some other factors. So we will be analyzing and coming to you with numbers on the impact of the coronavirus on the funding of ocean science. And we had a big dilemma to move forward with the decade or just to wait until the COVID situation is resolved. But ocean is a part of the answer of building back better. And that's exactly why we think that we need to move forward with ocean science that also has implications, positive implications for ocean health. Thank you very much, Ambassador Thomson, for offering me that platform for discussing with you the coalition number 7, the community number 7, and how it also can be moved forward with the advent of the decade of ocean science. Thank you so much. I'm returning.
And thank you, Vladimir. A great presentation. Your 10 challenges, the 10 challenges need to be far more widely spoken about, and I would certainly like to plagiarize them in my future presentations, if I may. I think what you said also followed on very nicely from what Dr. Vieras was saying about inclusivity. And, you know, inclusivity was the hallmark of the 2017 conference and of SDG 14 generally. I mean, this is a universal goal. There is no human being who's not affected by it, and it's for everybody to be included. As you said, engaging with partners, so important. And the way that IOC went about engaging with partners around the world and holding the regional meetings that you did in preparing the implementation plan for the decade was really a benchmark procedure for others to follow. So thank you for that. And you'll have a question coming to you a little later. But now I'll go to our second panelist, my dear friend, Martha Rojas Urego, who is the Secretary General of the Ramsar Convention on the wetlands, perhaps the most important part of our whole ecosystem, the wetlands. And she is going to speak on behalf of the Community of Ocean Action on mangroves. You have the floor, Secretary General.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador Thomson and DESA for organizing this. And you made the best opening for my remarks about the importance of these coastal and marine ecosystems, which are part of the whole ocean dynamics. And I'm very pleased to speak today as the focal point for the Community of Action on Mangroves, which I co-lead together with IUCN. So first of all, I think that it was very important to single out and to give particular attention to this ecosystem, mangroves, because when we think about nature-based solutions, it's difficult to think about an ecosystem that serves so many purposes. As you know, these ecosystems are one of the most effective carbon stores. They store 3 to 4 times more carbon than other terrestrial ecosystems. They are barriers that protect from extreme events. We know that when we have corridors of 100 meters wide of mangroves, they can have an impact in the wave height of 64%. So they're very important in terms of resilience and adaptation. They are a source of food as being the nurseries of many of the fisheries. They contribute to biodiversity, and the list could be very, very long. Still, we have 67% of the mangroves that have been lost in the last century. So that means that the urgency of protecting and restoring these ecosystems is key to achieve SDG 14 as well as other SDGs. So within this context, I would like to report on some highlights of the community of mangroves. First of all, since the conference, the Ocean Conference, we have 143 voluntary commitments from 42 countries. And I'm pleased to report that even with COVID, we continue to have new commitments coming in. These cover different areas. They cover restoration. We have 72% that cover restoration, which I think is very, very interesting. They cover the improvements of coastal communities' stewardship and participation. They cover adaptation to climate change, which, as we know, is one of these linkages that is essential between the ocean and climate change that you, Peter, were mentioning at the beginning. And this is done through public awareness to influencing policy, to establishing marine protected areas and coastal marine protected areas as some of the examples of the types of action that we are seeing in these commitments. We identified some challenges and gaps. These are very similar to those that Marjo mentioned in her presentation. Lack of sufficient data for assessing status and vulnerability of these ecosystems, limitations in technical capacity for restoration and management, funding as well, and policy gaps. One of the gaps that I would like to mention is also in terms of representation, because we have commitments from different sectors. We see that we should have more, for example, from the private sector, from scientific communities, and we should have more representation of one point that was made in terms of inclusion, and that's gender. And I take the opportunity to say that, as many of you, I am international gender champion, and it would be good to see, in these panels like today, more women represented, because gender is one of these multipliers of impact in addition to a key dimension of equity. So in terms of regions, we see an underrepresentation from West and East Africa, which we need to focus more on because they have very important extensions of mangroves. Now, turning to best practices and lessons, we have seen that we have very, very good examples that are ready to be scaled up in terms of international collaboration, for example. We have flagship voluntary commitments such as Save Our Mangroves Now, the Global Mangroves Alliance, which actually developed a very important innovation in the Global Mangrove Watch, which is an online platform that provides data accessible to everybody on the status of mangroves. And this is a very valuable way to address one of the gaps that I referred to regarding the lack of data. We also saw as best practices very important guidelines and tools that are being developed. And in particular, I would like to highlight two, one on mangrove restoration, and another one that is being developed and is on global green and gray community of practice. And this is very interesting because it's to develop more approaches where we have nature as a green infrastructure combined with gray infrastructure so that we can have more effective, more efficient ways of, for example, protecting coasts. In terms of other best practices and lessons, it was mentioned the importance of partnership and how by bringing different stakeholders, we can have better impact at global, regional, and national level. And here again, I would like to highlight the importance of engaging more women, and the gender perspective, as I mentioned before, is one of the key accelerators of impact in this SDG and other SDGs. The other highlight is how to use existing mechanisms. And here I would like to refer to the Ramsar Convention of Wetlands that I have the honor of being, I am the Secretary General of this convention, because there is a lot of national action in the 171 contracting parties, which adopted in the COP13 to which you participated, which adopted a resolution on blue carbon. So this is being implemented in all countries. But in addition, we have two regional initiatives registered as voluntary commitments. One is on coastal and marine ecosystems in West Africa, and another one is a regional initiative on coastal and marine ecosystems and focused on mangroves in Latin America. So all these initiatives can be scaled up, and I think that we have a lot of solutions that are ready to be scaled up and to enhance the impact that we need to get the ambition of the conservation of oceans that we are looking towards in SDG 14. And to close, regarding COVID, as I mentioned, we still have commitments, but of course this has have an impact in many of the communities of ocean action that are trying to move these initiatives forward. But we have also learned that with this tragic situation that we're living, that nature, the health of nature and the health of people are totally interconnected. And by conserving these ecosystems, we are contributing to having barriers between zoonotic diseases and people, as well as the ecosystem services like water, food, and all those that I mentioned before that are essential to building back better. So with this, as colleagues of this community of mangroves in the convention and in IUCN, we are absolutely committed to the Road of Lisbon that was mentioned by the Undersecretary General Serpa Soares. I think that we should adopt that. And we are using also this opportunity to call for scaling up efforts to stop the loss and to restore these mangroves as ecosystems that are essential to achieving SDG 14, the Paris Agreement, the UN Decade of Restoration, and the emerging global biodiversity framework. Thank you.
Really appreciate your original comment about mangroves and how they are nurseries for fisheries and protection against extreme events, and storms and so on, and the carbon storage, most importantly. But can I add to that ecotourism? Because I come from a mangrove coastline, and I spent my youth, in terms of fun, going around in small tin boats through the mangroves. And I do think that there is a huge potential for mangroves to be part of ecotourism, both in the existing mangrove forest, but in the restoration of. And I've seen that happening in China, where big restoration projects are underway. So ecotourism and mangrove forests, I do think under the sustainable blue economy, they have a big future together. I know you have to go to an emergency that you've been called to, and I thank you so much for sticking it out with us so bravely. So I do release you, and I'll put the question I was putting to you to somebody else later in the webinar. So thanks very much, Martin. I hope everything's okay. I'm now going to move to Janice Searle-Jones, who's the Chief Executive Officer for Ocean Conservancy, who's going to speak on behalf of the community of ocean on marine pollution. So are you there, Janice?
I am. Thank you so much for the introduction, Ambassador Thomson.
Okay, so over to you. Lovely to see your face. I'm just seeing you for the first time today.
Nice to see you too. I'm quite happy to be here today, and I want to express my sincere thanks to UNDESA for hosting this webinar, and to the hosts, Kenya and Portugal, for keeping attention focused on life below water and keeping up the momentum for building healthy ocean for ecosystems and coastal communities. As the CEO of Ocean Conservancy, I consider it our responsibility to support these efforts, and we've been at the helm as co-focal point of the Community of Ocean Action for Marine Pollution, alongside the leadership of the International Maritime Organization, led by Secretary General Mr. Kitak Lim, since the last UN Ocean Conference hosted in 2017 by Sweden and Fiji. This webinar comes at a really critical time, almost exactly 1 year since the global pandemic was declared. And while the world is strengthening its efforts to mobilize, create, and drive solutions to realize the 17 SDG goals by 2030, the context in which we have to realize these goals, especially SDG 14, has dramatically changed. How we respond to COVID-19 beyond the immediate and necessary recovery of health and livelihoods will likely determine not only whether we will reach SDG 14, but also how sustainable the world of tomorrow will be. In this new global context, the interconnectedness of the 17 SDGs has never been clearer. Taking care of and respecting our land, water, and ocean protects people and nature. And it's also clear that the importance of coordinating the actions of governments and state actors, as well as philanthropy, civil society, NGOs, networks of scientists, international bodies, all of these groups to solve global challenges like vaccinating the world's population, has never been clearer. I'm hopeful that perhaps there has never been a better time to commit ourselves to work collectively on our largest global challenges and recognize their and our interconnectedness. Taking, for example, tackling climate change and addressing plastic pollution, they are inherently linked. To protect our ocean and the communities that depend on them, we need to reduce the amount of plastic we use, especially single-use plastic items that are most likely to end up in the ocean. We need to better manage the plastic that is already in the system, and we need to clean up the plastic pollution that is already in the environment. Plastic in the ocean is a slow motion and persistent oil spill. Plastics are made from oil and gas, and to a lesser extent coal. They take decades to centuries to break down. The physical pollution of plastic in the ocean and the carbon emissions from producing plastic are two different forms of carbon pollution in the ocean, and both require our urgent attention. Current commitments by the private sector and world governments to reduce the amount of plastic entering our ocean and waterways are not nearly enough. If society implements all of these current commitments to reduce plastic pollution, we only stem the flow of plastics into the environment by 7%. And by 2050, the total cumulative greenhouse gas emissions from plastic production and incineration could be 56 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent, which is about 13% of the global carbon budget. So we have a climate problem and a plastics problem, and yet in reality, they are both a carbon problem. The community of ocean action on marine pollution and delivery on the voluntary commitments within this community is more relevant now than ever. Plastic pollution inputs into rivers and lakes and the ocean could increase to as much as 53 million metric tons annually by 2030, even if current reduction commitments are met. This is the equivalent of about one cargo ship's worth of plastics by weight entering aquatic systems every single day. And this figure doesn't even include abandoned, lost, and otherwise discarded fishing gear or ghost gear, which we know to be among the most prevalent form of large plastics in the ocean. And new inputs must also be taken into consideration. Today, Ocean Conservancy is releasing a report on the impact of personal protective equipment pollution in our communities and coastal areas. Ocean Conservancy knows from decades of experience, as we all do, that increased use of single-use plastics translates into more plastics in the ocean. And as the use of PPE and other single-use plastics increased over the course of the pandemic, our waste management systems have been struggling to keep up with it all. International coastal cleanup coordinators and volunteers collected more than 107,000 pieces of PPE from beaches and waterways around the world in less than 6 months last year, and we know that's just the tip of the iceberg. I've been fortunate enough to see firsthand how conservation victories happen and how they can be made more durable through strong partnerships and collaboration. For over 30 years, Ocean Conservancy has been working with governments, academia, industry, and other stakeholders to advance science-based solutions for a healthy ocean and the communities and wildlife that depend on it. This is the type of collaboration we want to continue fostering within our community of ocean action on marine pollution. The community of action is helping to increase awareness of the range of cross-cutting impacts that marine pollution, as well as solutions, can have. This allows members in the global community to take a more holistic approach to the implementation of their commitments. Right now, we know that within the COA on marine pollution, only about a third of country commitments refer to, leverage, or bolster other SDGs. Other insights surfaced through the COA include that the majority of the commitments on marine plastics are made at a national or a local level, whereas for shipping, it's reversed, with the majority of commitments at the regional and global scale. This isn't surprising since many of the marine litter commitments relate to local actions and cleanup operations, while the shipping commitments relate to an industry that is global in nature. However, in order to address the plastic pollution crisis, global ambition, action, and coordination is needed. Scaling up effective models and further engaging actors at all levels will help increase the impact of the community of ocean action. The pandemic has also shown that science is key to both fostering ambition and advancing solutions. The UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development will be critical in addressing current gaps in knowledge and supporting informed and inclusive decision-making and in accelerating new science-based voluntary commitments. The pandemic's also highlighted how dependent we are on the ocean for sustainable maritime trade. The ocean helps us ensure an uninterrupted supply of goods, food supplies, and medicines. And we know that the importance of the ocean will not diminish in the post-pandemic global recovery. So we have the possibility and the responsibility to ensure that the recovery is truly sustainable.
I think we've lost you there, Janice.
Can you hear me now?
If you can hear me,
I can.
we have lost you.
Actually, Peter, maybe this is you because we keep hearing well, and we like what we hear.
But are you hearing me?
Yes, I do.
Ambassador. We are all hearing And we are hearing Ms. Jones.
Yes.
Okay, I'll keep going then.
Okay. Can I hear from the Secretariat, please?
Ambassador, we can hear Ms. Jones and we can
Janet?
hear you.
Okay, I'm not getting a clear signal. Sorry, Janet, please continue.
So in the shipping sector, as well as in other ocean-based industries, progress is being made on issues such as marine plastic litter, climate change, and decarbonization. And that's both through the regulatory bodies and through the industry itself. And that's evident in the voluntary commitments in our COA, but we must do more. And we also need to ensure that no one is left behind and that capacity is built where it is needed. In the discussion about the global recovery and ocean governance in the post-pandemic world, I want to amplify what the previous speaker said. We need to ensure inclusive dialogues in all global and regional fora. Justice, equity, diversity, and an inclusive approach, ensuring that disadvantaged communities who are not continuously disproportionately affected by plastic and carbon pollution as they are now, should be a priority. We also must not lose track of the cross-cutting issues. The SDGs are intrinsically interlinked, and as we see with plastic pollution and climate change, you can't solve one without addressing the other. We need dialogue and, most importantly, action among ocean-dependent sectors across governance borders and between different parts of governance, government, civil society, and philanthropy in order to ensure a healthy, thriving, and resilient ocean for all of us. Again, many thanks to you, Ambassador Thomson, UN DESA, and Kenya and Portugal. Thank you all for your time, and I look forward to working with all of you.
No, the thanks to you, Yanis, and that was a great presentation. I'm sorry it seems that I lost the connection at this end. I thought it was at your end. So I really look forward to reading that report that you said is coming out, I think, today or tomorrow on the PPE pollution that the Ocean Conservancy is providing us all with a great service there. I'd love to read that. Yes, and also another correction on my side. I said that Martha Rojas had to leave, but in fact it was Dr. Vieros who had to leave for a family emergency. She's left us, so I hope that Martha is still with us and that I can pose a question to you on my favorite subject of mangroves. Look, it's now my pleasure to introduce David Cooper, who is the Deputy Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity. He's going to speak on behalf of the Community of Ocean Action on Marine and Coastal Ecosystems Management. You know, we said that the road to Lisbon goes on, but we should always remember that the road to Lisbon goes through Kunming and it goes through Glasgow. And I'm sure David Cooper can give us some information about what's going to happen when we get to Kunming. Over to you, David.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Thomson. Can you hear me?
Yes, very good.
Good. Yeah, and indeed, it's my great pleasure to join you all today on behalf of Elizabeth Marema, the Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity, to explore how we can ensure that we keep up the momentum for ocean action. And I'd like to start by thanking you, Ambassador Thomas, for your untiring efforts in this regard. We need to ensure that high-level political attention is kept on the ocean, and you're doing a great job in helping us to do that. You just mentioned Lisbon and Kunming, and in fact, the ongoing pandemic, of course, has disrupted our original plans for both the Ocean Conference and for COP15 of the CBD, the COP15 that's due to adopt a post-2020 global biodiversity framework. Of course, the pandemic will also have lasting changes for our society, but it doesn't change the urgent need for us to shift towards a more sustainable relationship with nature on land and in the oceans. And in fact, it's really another and very stark reminder of what can go wrong when we do not properly manage this relationship. And when I say we, I'm referring to governments, but also to the whole of society. And I think that's why this initiative is so important, and why it's so inspiring to see the enormous number of voluntary commitments made by nearly all sections of society. We in the CBD Secretariat, led by Elizabeth, have the honor of co-leading the Community of Ocean Action on Marine and Coastal Ecosystems Management. This is the largest of the communities, with some 760 members and over 900 voluntary commitments. So this community is broad and it's diverse, and it in fact overlaps with a lot of the other areas of community and ocean action. And this is natural, as biodiversity itself is cross-cutting, underpinning nearly all of the services that we depend on for a healthy planet and for a prosperous society. And Marta gave some good examples in her presentation just a little while ago. So we're pleased to have commitments from governments, from NGOs, from intergovernmental organizations, civil society, the private sector, academia, and the science community. Just for a moment, looking at protected areas and other effective conservation measures, we've made enormous progress in the last decade on this, and the voluntary commitments, once implemented, will help us to cross the line on the achievement of SDG 14.5. We hope that it can be the first SDG target that's met, as well as H.E. target 11. But of course, the commitments are much broader than that. They cover much more. As I mentioned, they overlap significantly with all of the other communities and address not only all of the SDG 14 targets, but nearly all of the other SDGs as well. In reviewing the underlying reasons why we didn't fully achieve the H.E. biodiversity targets, and we did this analysis in the 5th edition of the Global Biodiversity Outlook published last year, a key one, it was that we didn't sufficiently galvanize action across the different sectors of society. And a major lesson is that we need to do that. We need to catalyze action across all of those who use and depend on biodiversity, including the economic sectors. So we and the parties, in preparing for COP15 and developing the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, are working hard to do that. The framework, of course, will contain a new set of global goals and targets for biodiversity to be adopted in Kunming. We're working to make the process to develop this framework open and inclusive. So engaging all the stakeholders and integrating the views, perspectives, and priorities of all interests. And we really encourage all of you in this community to engage with the CBD to help us ensure that ocean interests are fully reflected. In fact, we're able to leverage the experience of the voluntary commitment holders to inform the development of the framework through a workshop we convened in 2019 together with the 2020 Oceans Pathway meeting, convened in fact together with the coral reef and mangrove communities. And so the post-2020 framework will be not only a CBD framework, but a framework for the entire global community. And we hope that it will speak directly to the social, cultural, and economic benefits that have their foundation in biodiversity, and therefore where action is needed across these different sectors. It will be evidence-based, based on the best science and traditional knowledge, as well as the experience of countries and actors. And in this respect, it's inspiring to see among the many commitments in our community, and Mario made this point also in her presentation, that there are commitments from indigenous peoples and local communities, and local level actors can indeed be powerful stewards for conservation and sustainable use of ocean biodiversity. But as others have acknowledged, we also need to address the broader aspects of the current economic systems that have failed us and failed nature, with many opportunities to tackle these problems. And one of the most notable is the need to address the enormous amount of harmful fishery subsidies. And I expect Manuel will also talk about this. These subsidies represent huge amounts of funding that could contribute instead to supporting healthy and productive fisheries and healthy and productive ecosystems. The Dasgupta review published earlier this year clearly explains why we should invest in nature, but also points out that currently governments almost everywhere are exacerbating the problem by paying people more to exploit and destroy nature than to protect it. As others have mentioned, I think we have a major opportunity, an imperative really, in COVID-19 recovery measures to correct this, or to begin to correct this. And especially when we recognize that conservation and restoration of biodiversity in fact contributes to human health and can help reduce the risk of disease. So let's look at actions such as improving incentives for conservation and sustainable use, for promoting jobs, livelihoods, income support that also contributes to biodiversity conservation, to sustainable use, and to restoration in looking at economic recovery and stimulus and recovery measures. And this would also help address a key factor that we too often neglect. We understand that some 40% of the voluntary commitments report challenges in implementation, including inadequate funding and lack of human resources. We need to ensure that the commitments are backed up by action, and for that they need resources. The good news, of course, is we do have the tools, we do have the knowledge to address these issues and these challenges. The voluntary commitments have shined a light on bright spots and reasons for optimism. We need to continue to focus on bringing the ambition of these commitments to reality. Let's build on the successes, let's scale them up to put us on a path towards a sustainable future for the ocean, to bend the curve of biodiversity loss, and put ourselves on a nature on a path to this 2050 vision that we have under the Convention on Living in Harmony with Nature. Thanks very much for the opportunity to join this panel. Thank you very much, Peter.
Thank you, David. Yeah, very provocative stuff on the subsidies. I agree with you 100%. Imagine if that $20 to $30 billion of monies, which are public monies, which are put into harmful fisheries subsidies every year. Imagine if that $20 to $30 billion instead was being put into helping coastal communities, vulnerable coastal communities, women in particular, thank you, Martha, to get into sustainable aquaculture, non-fed aquaculture like mussels and seaweed and so on. Imagine what we could do with that money. Instead, it goes to industrial fishing fleets to go out and do what they do. Okay, we'll see you in Kunming. That road to Lisbon goes through Kunming, and the ocean hosts the vast majority of life, i.e. biodiversity, on this planet. So we expect the ocean to be front and center, not only there, but in Glasgow. Okay, with that, I go to Mr. Fisheries himself, and I'd like to bring in Dr. Manuel Barrage from FAO. And he, as I'm sure you know, is the Director of Fisheries Division at FAO, and he's going to speak on behalf of the Community of Ocean Action on Sustainable Fisheries. Over to you, Manuel.
Good, thank you. Good afternoon, Ambassador, and good afternoon, everyone. I hope that you can hear me well, and thank you for giving me the floor. And as you know, I work for FAO, the agency dedicated to ending hunger and poverty by promoting the sustainable use of natural resources. Let me start by saying that I do not quite subscribe to any dichotomy between nature and humans. We see humans as part of nature, and so I believe that the increasing pressure that we are putting on natural resources must be fixed through managing our actions rather than by staying away from nature. And that's why we say often in FAO that management is the best conservation. Now let me just move quickly to Community of Action 9, Sustainable Fisheries, an action that is made up from 500 voluntary commitments to conserve and sustainable use oceans, seas, and marine resources for sustainable development. The commitments are overwhelmingly focused on advancing SDG 14 targets, in particular 14.4, 14.6, 14.7, and 14.9. We've just had an excellent, well-documented summary of these targets in today's keynotes, and I'd like to congratulate the keynote speaker for that. I thought it was a very excellent review. But as the custodian agency for the indicators of these 4 targets, let me just go through a brief assessment of the trends in those, as this points towards the work that the Community of Action needs to do in the road to Lisbon. First, on indicator 14.4.1, the proportion of fish stocks within biologically sustainable levels. It is well known that while marine fish catches have remained remarkably stable since the mid-1990s, the stock sustainability has declined from about 90% of stocks fished within biologically sustainable levels in 1974 to 65.8% in the last assessment. This is by number. By volume of fish in the market, it's pleasing to know that about 78% of the fish reaching the market is from sustainable stocks. The rate of decline in sustainability has slowed down. This is reassuring, but this has not been enough to turn the tide. Now, there's very good evidence that demonstrates that when management measures are implemented, stocks rebuild and sustainability improves. But this requires more than technical solutions. It also requires political will and a full understanding of the underlying causes that limit this political will. So what do we need to reverse this trend? First, better assessment methodologies in data poor situations, and to build the institutional, scientific, and management capacity in places where sustainability is deteriorating or is unknown. And we need to remember that it is difficult to do so for countries where the costs for developing countries for this developing this infrastructure exceeds in many cases the revenues of fishing. There is a balance that needs to be achieved. In case of 14.6.1, the progress by countries in the degree of implementation of international instruments to combat IUU fishing. Now, we all know that there's always a slight difference between the targets and the indicators, and the target focus a lot about subsidies. I will not say much.
I think Dr. Baranj is disconnected.
I think so too.
Okay, very good. We'll wait for Manuel to come back, but in the meantime, I think we'll move on to the next speaker. And I guess I'll ask Manuel to resume his presentation just before we get to the Q&A, Madhu. So
Sure.
If somebody could get hold of him by phone and just let him know what's happened. Thank you. So I'm now going to move to our sixth panelist, who's Dr. Peter Swazenski, who's the section head of radio ecology at the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA. based in Monaco. He will speak on behalf of the Community of Ocean Action on ocean acidification. So Dr. Swazenski, you have the floor. I think you're muted, Peter. Can you? I can see your presentation, but I can't hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
I can hear you.
Excellent. Let me make it full screen. I think this should switch to full screen. Okay, Ambassador Thomson, thank you very much for this opportunity to present on ocean acidification. I wanted to also thank DESA and Portugal and Kenya for keeping us on track on this very important community of ocean action. I would like to mention that Dr. Bronte Tilbrook from CSIRO in Hobart, Australia is my co-focal point for this community of ocean action, and I'm working here in Monaco with Trevor, Carolina, and Hosty, as well as Kirsten Isense at IOC UNESCO in Paris. So what I would like to do in my quick presentation is give you 3 takeaway messages. Number 1, that ocean acidification is truly global. We know a lot about the chemistry, which is predictable, but the impacts to the biology are very complicated and up till now still not yet known. Nonetheless, OA has a tremendous impact in all corners of the world. As was mentioned by Dr. Vieros, the OA community is indeed exceptional. We work really well together from research universities to NGOs to foundations. And as a consequence of this good working relationship, we, I think, have been very effective in moving the bar of ocean acidification further, in this case, in regards to the community of ocean actions. And the last take-home point is just going to present a few kind of tangible results and progress that will be presented here, again, within this framework that has already been nicely set up. So with this first slide, I just wanted to mention, out of the 1,642 voluntary commitments, 277 directly and indirectly address ocean acidification. So directly work towards SGD 14.3, which is to reduce ocean acidification. So out of those 277, just under 200 indirectly address ocean acidification, and roughly 80 address either only OA or primarily OA. So in this presentation, in this slide, I wanted to show the geographic scope of the voluntary commitments on ocean acidification and put them in a geographic context. So a couple of take-home messages here are that almost half of all the voluntary commitments are global in scale. And if you start looking at the individual regions, you can see there's some interesting patterns. For example, in the Indian Ocean, we have 23% represented, whereas, for example, in the South Pacific, we have 18. In the North Pacific, we have 21. And I think this variance in the geographic scope is due to some very strong regional hubs on ocean acidification, such as, for example, in East Africa. I also wanted to mention that some of the voluntary commitments target more than one region. So if we wanted to see how the ocean acidification voluntary commitments might address other SGD 14 targets, I have these kind of represented as a bar graph. Most of them, as you would expect, because of the scientific nature of this voluntary commitment, address 14.8, which is an increase in scientific knowledge. 14.1 to reduce marine pollution has roughly a quarter of them, as does to protect and restore ecosystems, 14.2. And I won't go into other details, but you can see these trends are kind of aligned with the scope of ocean acidification work. So if we want to think about this in terms of the other SGDs, how does 14.3 affect some of the other SGDs? It obviously affects climate change, and I think following what you said, Ambassador Thomson, from the Monaco Ocean Week, the Blue Initiative last week in Monaco. John Kerry, the special envoy to the oceans from the U.S., I think very eloquently also underscored the importance that ocean and climate are two sides of the same coin. And so if we want to work on one, we really have to absolutely be working on the other. And so climate action is obviously the very important other SGD. 17 partnerships for the goals, I think, underscores how interrelated ocean acidification is. And 12, the responsible consumption and production is another important sustainable development goal for this voluntary commitment. So to give you just a quick overview, and I think some of this was nicely presented by Dr. Verhos, but roughly 20% of the OA voluntary commitments were submitted since 2017, of which 40 are direct OA voluntary commitments. 50% are due to end before 2021, and so we have a call to arms to make sure that we keep these going. 40% of the OAs have submitted progress reports to date and have been successfully implemented. So I think this is a really nice result. Most progress reports for commitments are still pending, so we have some of our homework here on that. And then less than 20% of the submitted voluntary commitments have deliverables post-2020. So I think there's urgency for us to kind of re-energize the community and highlight its continuing achievements and to motivate further action. So some progress on deliverables. The OA Alliance and the Ocean Conservancy have done a tremendous job to continue to develop partnerships, to develop their ocean action toolkit and to engage new members in the OA community. Go on, the Global Ocean Acidification Observing Network has recently added the Arctic Hub to its network and continues to organize large virtual meetings and seminars. IOC UNESCO has put forth a data portal, and I have an example of the data portal on the right-hand side of this slide, which now allows member states to directly report on 14.3.1. And if you look at the right-hand side of this slide, you can see there's a success story that both Colombia, Cuba, and Mexico all have recently been able to report back to 14.3.1. So this is one of the tools that allows member states to directly engage in the 2030 agenda and here in the community of ocean action. So I think there's been tremendous progress. We had just 8 member states reporting, and now we have 30. The Ocean Foundation has done a very solid job in conducting trainings around the globe. And I will end here with the OAICC, our own OAICC, the International Coordination Center that is managed out of Monaco, that has, through the years, done a tremendous job building capacity, conducting trainings, and being involved in all aspects of ocean acidification. And I have one summary slide on this, that just since the OAICC has been initiated in 2012, we have more than 850 capacity building opportunities involving 750 scientists from more than 100 member states that have been engaged in global OA capacity building events. And of course, this is not in isolation, but can happen because we have excellent relationships with many of our partners and collaborators, some of which are shown at the bottom of the slide. So in terms of next steps, this has been brought up, I think, very clearly. 2020 was quite challenging, and the early 2021, again, we'd have no in-person meetings. So for a global initiative like, for example, OAICC, we're very interested in developing global capacity on ocean acidification. We need to rethink how we can deliver and engage in capacity transfer with our member states. But there's some interesting opportunities. As we have learned now over the last year, there's lots of new opportunities for inclusive participation, and this was something that was mentioned earlier. Ambassador Thomson, you also mentioned, with the lack of travel, we have a much reduced carbon footprint, and we have also have not been able to spend as much money on these kinds of training. So again, strong need to develop new ways of being able to deliver capacities to our member states. Going forward, we want to highlight some OA success stories, and I think we have several of them that have done a really fantastic job at delivering on their voluntary commitments, and we would like to highlight these success stories. We want to have follow up on existing voluntary commitments, but also encourage new submissions. As I showed very quickly there, we had a huge influx of voluntary commitments after the New York conference 2017, and we want to make sure that this continues. The Global Ocean OA community put together a program for consideration for the Ocean Decade, and I think this, again, depending on how this develops, I think will be a great opportunity for us to congeal around global OA and to look for new ways that we can build partnerships, build capacity, especially in areas where there may be some gaps, and to engage inclusively with all of our member states and with all those who are interested in ocean acidification from all the different perspectives. And then lastly, just a small mechanistic footnote is that over the last couple of years, we've had several webinars, maybe quarterly, and we now have an upcoming webinar, I think, slated for next month, to again show some of the different perspectives on the COA on ocean acidification, and to highlight some success stories. So with that quick overview of where we are on the community of ocean actions on ocean acidification, I would like to hand it back to you, Ambassador Thomson.
Thank you very much, Peter. I've been a great admirer of the work of the membership of your Community of Ocean Action since 2017 onwards. This is our big link, SDG 14.3, to the Glasgow COP. Again, it's the UN Decade of Ocean Science, where we look for, your opportunity to really advance ocean acidification along with deoxygenation and ocean warming. That is the existential challenge for the ocean. And so thank you for the great work that you're doing, and thanks for that presentation. Our final panelist, hoping to get Manuel back at some stage, but our final panelist is Dr. Takahiro Nakamura, who's the coordinator for Marine and Coastal Ecosystems Unit for UNEP, based in Nairobi, who's going to present on the implementation status and updates of the Community of Ocean Action on Coral Reefs. Takahiro, if you can hear me, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Peter. Can you hear me?
I can, loud and clear.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to really present the Coral Reef Community of Ocean Action. This is managed by the United Nations Environment Program and the International Coral Reef Initiatives. And unfortunately, our core focal points cannot really come to this meeting in person. So on behalf of UNEP and H.E, I'm making a presentation on this Coral Reef Community of Ocean Action. I think Ambassador Thomson already mentioned about the scenarios of the climate change in relation to the scenarios of the state of the coral reef or in the future. It's kind of really miserable picture that the IPCC report and the IPCC report already mentioned. And actually, the same IPCC report on oceans and cryosphere already mentioned that the tropical coral reef is the most vulnerable ecosystems to the climate change. So this Coral Reef Community of Action, in relation to all these threats to this important ecosystems, we try to really associate this Community of Ocean Action with mainly the Sustainable Development Goal target 14.2, but also linked with the other SDG 14 related targets. And then we are naturally working closely with other community of actions, particularly the COA on mangroves and COA and ecosystems. Those are already presented. Okay, the Coral Reefs Community of Action, the currently 107 members and 158 commitments. And I have to also note that the 2 additional members joined since the May 2019, and the 22 additional commitments also added to this community of action since the same time. And in terms of the reporting rate, I'm very happy to really report that the 30.4% of the voluntary commitments already reported on the progress of the implementation, which is a bit higher than the average presented by the Mario in the keynote speech. In order to really bring up the issue of the coral reef community of action, in fact, this community of action already prepared a video to really sensitize everybody to really report on the community of action related to voluntary commitments, as well as joining this important community of action. So this video is on this YouTube channel of the UNEP. So everybody, if you are really interested in how this community of action is sensitizing this important area, please go and look at this YouTube channel. In order to getting into, I just would like to make a little bit slightly different presentation today as compared to the other community of action. I just would like to really highlight kind of really further actions we are taking in terms of really pushing the voluntary commitment for implementation. Before that, I just would like to really say that the Global Coral Reef Monitoring Program under the ICRI, together with us, are preparing a kind of new report on the status of the coral reef that is supposed to be really launched in May 2021. This is the largest coral reef data set ever assembled over the 40 years, and more than 75 countries, hundreds of science, over 2 million observations are contributing the data to this status. And then since 2008, this is the kind of really new report on the status of the coral reef. And we are hoping that this report will show the indication of the achievement of SDG target 14.2 from the more coral reef perspective, whether the countries, the stakeholders are doing well about achieving the 14.2 from the coral reef perspectives. And today, I just would like to really address some of the gaps and the challenges identified by Mario in the keynote speech. She mentioned that the biggest challenge are 3 in this 14.2. The one, lack of capacity. The second, lack of financing. And then third, lack of awareness on the coral reef related issues. Through this community of action, and then through ICRI and the UNEP action, we are addressing those gaps and then challenges. And then first, I just would like to really introduce Global Fund for Coral Reefs. This fund has been established already under the UN Multi-Partnership Trust Fund. And then 3 organizations, United Nations Development Program, United Nations Capital Development Fund, and the UNEP, United Nations Environment Program, together with Balkan Prince Albert Foundation, and then other donors already established this Global Fund for Coral Reefs. And we are aiming at something like US dollars 500 million blended financing vehicle for coral reef conservation for the next 10 years. So we are hoping that this will accelerate the implementation of the voluntary commitments. Another financial mechanism which we are really trying to address is the UNEP ICRI small grant program. And we already finished the first round of small grant activities for the coral reef and coral reef associated ecosystems. And we are going around the second phase of the funding, grants up to the US dollars, $80,000. This is the small grant activities aiming at the local level, the local government, local NGOs, and that will really help in progressing in the implementation of sustainable management, protection and restoration of coral reefs, mangroves, and the seagrass. Those are currently considered to be the associated ecosystems to the coral reefs. Also implementing various UNEP and ICRI-related guidelines. Under the Coral Reef Community of Action, it's not really the activities of the Coral Reef Community of Action. At the same time, many of the voluntary commitment holders are also participating in ICRI-related discussions. And under the ICRI, there was already recommendations prepared on the coral reef to be submitted to the post-2020 Global Diversity Framework. As David Cooper mentioned, that the post-2020 Global Diversity Framework is an important milestone before the UN conference. And then we are also very happy that the ICRI and the coral reef communities are also sending important recommendations to the post-2020 Global Diversity Frameworks and emphasizing on the indicators and the possible targets related to the coral reef to be included in the Global Diversity Framework. Next one, this decade is not only the UN decade on the ocean science for sustainable development, it's also the UN decade on ecosystem restoration, 2021 to 2030. We are also working very closely with FAO. So because the UNEP and FAO are functioning as the lead organization for the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. And we are very happy that we are also pushing our systems and the UN Decade to include more on the coral reef related restoration. And in order to do that, UNEP and ICRI already published the Restoration Best Practices Report in January this year. And we are pushing the application of these guidelines through the Global Fund for Coral Reef and small grant activities. And then this is also requested by our assembly. So we are also hoping that this kind of guidelines or the restoration for the coral reef would also be used and utilized by the voluntary commitment holders more and more. And finally, that in relation to the lack of awareness, as UNEP has promoted the visibility of the coral reefs through the social media campaign. It's called Growing, Growing, Gone campaign. And the email address, the website address also written here. And this is the partnership with Adobe and the Ocean Agency and the celebrity and ocean expert influencer in the social media campaigns, also providing quite strong input into this campaign. And we are also very happy that quite a lot of interesting social media-based discussion is happening, and all these leaders of and the influencers are providing necessary implementation related activities and the information to this the campaign. And then we are also trying to really reach out to the community of action, voluntary commitment holders to really participate and then involved in this the campaign. And there was the Reef Life exhibition at the Beijing airport recently. And we are also trying to really have more digital interactive stories to really highlight the scientific information and other the ICRI and the UNEP related information through this campaign. And finally, I think this is my last slide. And then community of action. we are still really pushing the community members to really implement their activities and report back to the Community of Action website. And then we are also trying to really reach out through our network and through ICRI network to really join this important Community of Action more and more. And also we, as I indicated, that we have more and more supporting tools, supporting financial mechanisms and a different campaign to really engage more stakeholders, more people in this important Community of Action. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Takahiro. That's a very interesting presentation. You know, I mentioned the road to Lisbon, going through Kunming and going through Glasgow. But of course, it also goes through Nairobi in February with the second session of UNEA 5, where over 2/3 of the membership member states has called for a treaty on marine plastic pollution. And I certainly join in support with them. So that Nairobi is also on our road to Lisbon. Thank you so much for that presentation. I'll come back to you with a question shortly, but can I just see if Manuel Barange is with us? If you are, Manuel, you were halfway through your speech when you went silent. So if you'd like to resume halfway through, we're all ears. Over to you.
Thank you, Peter. And my apologies. You know, the captain used to tell me everything in our favor is against us. You know, the technology let me down. I won't put you through the speech, but I'll just use perhaps the opportunity to just wrap it up with my final elements of the speech, which was actually to say that, you know, the road to Portugal, it also passes through Rome. As you may recall, and many of you were present in Rome in 2019, at the end of 2019, for the FAO International Symposium on Fishery Sustainability. And many of the community were there. And that event allowed us to provide a number of solutions, specifically technical solutions to make aquatic food systems more sustainable, more resilient, and socially just. Those messages, which are very relevant to the Community of Action, were then taken forward to the Committee on Fisheries of FAO, which is the forum where the 194 members of FAO agreed on collective solutions. And that meeting approved a declaration for sustainable fisheries and aquaculture, a negotiated political document of member countries, which has just been passed, and a lot of the elements in that declaration would allow us to push forward on the elements of the Community of Action number 9 more effectively. I think that perhaps all I want to say is that, as everyone knows, it is extremely difficult to achieve all the goals of SDG 14. We're moving slowly in the right direction. There are many indicators of positive direction in the right direction, and we need to just encourage that process through member countries. And I hope that by the time we get to Portugal, to Lisbon, Ambassador, that at that point we would have demonstrated a much stronger commitment, political commitment of countries, which is what is needed, as well as the technical solutions. And with that, I'll rather pass on the microphone to you and hope that I can stay until your question.
Great. Thanks very much for that quick wrap up there, Manuel. And, you know, I just underline what you said earlier about management being the best form of conservation, the FAO dictum on that. And you and I and others with the Friends of Ocean Action are going to be having a good hard look at, you know, how to improve the bits of management that are not working well enough. And really look forward to your good advice on that. SDG 14.4, of course, depends upon it. So look, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to move now. We're still in the panel section, but we're going to go to the Q&A segment, the question and answers. And I'm going to ask the panelists each a question. And if they keep their answers to about 3 minutes, we should be able to get through within our time allocation. So without further ado, I'm going to go straight to Vladimir Ryabinin and put a question to him which relates to the UN decade. And Vladimir, can I ask you, what do you see as the role of universities and academia in achieving SDG 14 and the UN decade of ocean science?
Thank you very much, Peter. I would like to say that, you know, this question kind of looks obvious, but actually it is not, because you know, it is difficult to foresee all the turns on the of this road that the decade is taking. I can only say that definitely there are two roles that are important. This is the teaching and higher education role. I would like simply to refer to the fact that, for example, China Ocean University has of the order of 50,000 students that are going to be future workers in the ocean. So that is the scale of education that is taking place in that country. I think the whole world needs that, and this is going to be also international education. Also, there are some associations of universities that now are trying to create curriculum and also divide. This is very difficult to get so that students could get credits from different universities and get best education according to their interest. This is also very important, but it's very, very difficult to achieve. And of course, both universities and academic science, they are those who really are able to tackle the most fundamental problems of science. And this is true for oceanography. This is true for ocean sciences and biodiversity sciences. You yourself, Peter, mentioned this nexus of climate, ocean, biodiversity. So you know they're all connected. And I would like to say that there are fantastic developments in the domain of climate that is so important for oceanography in terms of climate modeling, prediction, and you know, upscaling that work so that is also is able to embrace the modeling of ecosystems and modeling of the different aspects of the ocean circulation and the regime. So I think without universities, without academic communities, also without the support from the highest echelons of hierarchy in this, I think it will be very difficult for us to have as capable decade as required. So, and I would like also to say that in the decade we have special emphasis on the early ocean career professionals, and they are coming from those sources. So you know the future, and you often allude to the future. So that future that it is of the decadal scale really depends on the early career professionals and how universities will be feeding that human power to success. Not of the decade, because the success of the decade is not important. It's what the decade is going to deliver is important for the future of humanity, for the future of the ocean and the planet. So yeah, huge role. But this is for everyone. And the decade advisory board that we're going to constitute definitely will require most talented people coming from universities, coming from academia, along with all other types of stakeholders. Thank you.
No, thank you, Vladimir. A very thoughtful answer. And I must say that I had a small role in posing this question to you when I was talking through things with DESA. And one of the things that attracts me so much in this area is it's a great vehicle for technology and knowledge transfer, north and south, east and west. You know, as you know, I come from Fiji, and the University of South Pacific is owned by all the member countries of the Pacific Island countries. I've been encouraging them for the last couple of years. Get involved. You know, this is a fantastic time for partnership between North and South universities. I'll leave you with this thought on that question, though, which is that I do think there is still a problem when you get to primary school and secondary schools around the world of getting the ocean into school curriculums. You know, you mentioned ocean literacy earlier. You know, we really need some avenues into the ministries of education to get ocean literacy into school curriculums around the world. And that's pretty universal, what I find.
If I may, then Peter, you know, we are working on it, and 36 countries already have some progress in there. And with those developments, there will be a very soon surge of students studying oceanography coming from schools that are enabled by ocean literacy.
Bravo, good to hear that. Janice Searle, I'm going to go to you next. And my question actually relates to that report you were telling us about. I didn't actually know there was that report on PPE coming out from Ocean Conservancy. Good news. Anyway, the question is, during COVID-19, there has been an increased use of plastic, not to mention dumping of PPE and other medical waste in the ocean. How can we better address this problem? And are you aware of anything positive being done about it? Janice,
Thank you. I want to just start by acknowledging that the COVID-19 pandemic has taken an unfathomable toll on people and families and communities. So when we talk about its impact on the ocean, we just want to acknowledge the incredible loss around the world that we have all been experiencing throughout COVID-19. And we're really optimistic now that vaccine rollouts in certain countries are ramping up, and very hopeful that that will spread rapidly globally. But it's also really clear that the pandemic's not just impacting human health, but also the environment, and particularly our ocean. So one of the things that the pandemic did was dramatically increase the use of certain types of plastic products, PPE, as you mentioned, but also single-use plastic bags, food and beverage containers, and other single-use plastics that can harm our communities, harm our ocean, and result in really significant waste management challenges. We know from decades of experience that increased single-use plastics translates into more plastics in the ocean. And what has been really apparent through the proliferation of use of PPE is how quickly things move from production into the ocean. And so our report that's coming out today shows that of over 200 international coastal cleanup volunteers and coordinators that we surveyed, 94% of them observed PPE pollution at a cleanup in 2020. So we know how rapidly PPE has moved into the environment. And what that really shows us is how steep the toll of single-use plastics is on our waterways, our shoreline, and the ocean. And so the good news here, I think, is that that visible rapidity with how quickly things have moved from production into the ocean is continuing to raise awareness, is continuing to raise a desire to actually do something about single-use plastics, is continuing to raise ambition about what we need to do, and is increasing the support and the pressure both for voluntary commitments and for policy instruments. And so there are a lot of things that we can do now. The report outlines a number of simple recommendations for businesses, for individuals, like making sure that there are adequate disposal receptacles in places that have really high foot traffic, like grocery stores, retail stores, other places where people are putting on and taking off masks. Simple things like cutting the ear loops on face masks so that we reduce the entanglement risk to animals, and supporting solo or socially distant cleanups in the communities when possible. But importantly, it also gets at that bigger picture systems change that we need to have around single-use plastics. And it includes policy recommendations for federal, state, and local governments. And just as one example, in the United States, we have the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act currently in Congress. And this is a comprehensive, ambitious piece of legislation, and it hits all of the most important policy levers available to tackle the ocean plastics crisis. So that's reducing our reliance on single-use plastics, mandating recycled content minimums, holding producers responsible for their waste that their products generate. And as several of the other presenters have noted, for community and ocean health, these actions need to be concomitant with emissions reductions. So internationally, we need to continue to invest in rapidly transitioning to a zero emissions future while also reducing our reliance on single-use plastics. So the good news about the PPE report is it really shines a light on the systems change that needs to happen and will bring more impetus and public support to those voluntary commitments and those policy changes that we all need to have this lead to a healthier ocean and healthier communities for all of us.
Thanks, Janice. That's a very comprehensive answer to a very complex problem. I'm sure that, all of us have walked down our streets and looked at those discarded masks on the pavements and in the gutters and just thought, oh my God, we can do better. So folks, you've heard it from Janice Jones there. Read that Ocean Conservancy report and you'll get some clearer answers to what we can do about that problem. You know, I used to get red around the ears when I looked at the cigarette butts in my gutter. Now I get red around the ears when I look at those discarded COVID masks. And, you know, the cigarette butts are a disrespect to life in the ocean, but those discarded masks, I find them a disrespect to health workers and to the people who are in hospital sick, you know, because those discarded masks can only exacerbate the problem. So thanks for that, Jonas. I'm moving now to the third question, which I'm putting to Martha Rojas, who happily is still with us, didn't have to leave for any emergency. That was Dr. Vieros who had to go. And this question relates to the movement of ships and pleasure craft through marine environments. You know, because that human ship and craft traffic through these environments causes pollution. It pretty much can't help doing it. The chemicals on its hulls and through what's being dumped over the side of the vessels. When we get spills, oil spills, chemical spills, when we have strikes, you know, the striking of whales and other marine mammals. And a lot of people don't understand about the extent of noise and the damage that does to the marine ecosystem and those that are living within it. So what actions are being proposed for the protection and conservation of marine flora and fauna in these circumstances? Martha, over to you. Are you there, Martha?
Yes, no, sorry, I was on mute. So yes, I'm happy to be here still. Very interesting discussion. So I think, Peter, what you are this relates with the comment that you made before when I spoke about the benefits of mangroves and coastal and marine ecosystems. And it's that part of their values is that they're very attractive for tourism, and for people to visit. And what we are seeing is the excess and the impacts of tourism in this type of ecosystems. So, and these affect not only the biodiversity, but also the livelihoods of many communities. So how to deal with that? Well, I think that we have to look at different set of measures. And one is, of course, the appropriate management and the appropriate planning and monitoring of this type of impacts. And it's taken into account, of course, the impact that they have and how we can address it through using different models of tourism and different models that are more respectful of these environments. And this includes cleaner technologies, including of transport. We have seen how you can use different types of vessels and to visit, you know, these places that are important sources of tourism that are less damaging. It is also environmental regulations and policies that are more respectful of the environment. It is integrated approaches that take into account not only the pollution that is coming, you know, from this transport, but also how that makes it even worse with the pollution that might be coming upstream through waste that is dumped into rivers and lakes that end up also in this type of fragile ecosystems. So I think that it's important to look at the problem itself and how to plan better for that. But we have to look also at one point that was made in this discussion, which is that these ecosystems are important for other benefits. And how can we look in a more holistic way that by having these practices, they are not only affecting the source of the revenues, you know, in damaging these places that are important for tourism, but they are also damaging other services that cost a lot, you know, like to have otherwise. And this includes the livelihoods, the fisheries, the water. So in addition to the tourism amenities, is how can we look at multiple benefits and the solution that will have an impact on different parts of the agenda, biodiversity, but also in the livelihoods of people and the economic opportunities. So again, I think that it's a matter of looking across the board at how, you know, like these ecosystems being values that we need to take into account from all dimensions, from tourism as well as other benefits.
Thank you, Martha. And I repeat what I said when I introduced you in the first place, that, you know, wetlands have to be the most important part of our whole ecosystem, I think, whether you think about it from food or health. You're doing a great job there as Secretary General of the Ramsar Convention. So thank you for joining us today. Manuel, you know, aquaculture has come up right from the beginning. Where USG Liu mentioned it, and various people have mentioned in relation to coastal ecosystems. And I think you yourself mentioned it. But can aquaculture be made fully sustainable in the environmental sense? I mean, we know that it's a great success in terms of the economic side of things, but in the environmental side, can it be fully sustainable?
Thank you, Peter. Well, I think that first we will need to define what we mean by fully environmentally sustainable. If it is a production system without any environmental impact, then it is probably not possible. All food systems have impacts. Some are more manageable than others through agreed trade-offs. But if we mean systems that can continue to produce without continuing to environment, then certainly aquaculture has an enormous potential. It is a very diverse sector, as you know, from seaweeds to bivalve mariculture, which actually are environmentally positive, arguably the most environmentally friendly food production systems there are, to carnivorous fish culture that requires space, food, seeds, and disease controls. So basically what we're trying to do is make sure that we make it as sustainable as possible. And I'll tell you the main things that we're doing at the moment. So we're currently developing sustainable aquaculture guidelines for the world. This is a commitment to FAO, and we are going through now through regional consultations to make sure that we understand and we pick up the best practices throughout. And that will be part of this document, which will be eventually agreed by member countries. We are addressing biosecurity challenges from infections of parasites, bacteria, viruses, fungi, whatever, including antimicrobial use issues, through the implementation of what we call the progressive management pathway, which is an extension of what is being applied to land-based animal production. And this is part of the One Health approach. We're also working with WHO and with Codex Alimentarius to set codes of practice in the production of fish products. These are revised regularly every year to every 2 years. And we work with private sector to encourage less dependency on marine-based feeds. And you perhaps don't know this, but production has grown by a factor of 6 since the mid-1990s, while fish meal production has actually declined by half in the same period. So there's been an enormous improvement in terms of making use of better feeds rather than relying on marine products. Finally, I'd just like to say that aquaculture is a relatively new industry at the global scale, and its potential is massive. But like any other food system, requires trade-offs that need to be agreed and need to be enforced. Food is not optional, as we all know, but perhaps let me turn the question to you, Peter. If aquaculture and fisheries fail to become sustainable, then the impact of our land-based food production systems on our environment will be even higher. So that's the incentive to make it as sustainable as possible.
Great response, and sounds like the challenge is for us all to transition to eating more shellfish and seaweed that has been produced by aquaculture. And just to give you an assurance and listeners that Agnes Kalibata and I and our secretariats are working closely in the approach to the UN Food Systems Summit, likewise her cooperation around the road to Lisbon. Which we're running short of time, so I'm going to quickly segue to David Cooper. And David, I'm going to ask you this question. In view of the need for a whole of society approach to achieve sustainable development in the ocean, what's being done to ensure that all stakeholders will play an active role in implementing the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, particularly with the emphasis on the ocean? So David, over to you.
Thanks very much. And yeah, I mean, this is really important, of course, because all of these different problems that we've heard about from the various panelists, and I want to endorse what my fellow panelists have said, are interlinked. So we will only address the biodiversity problem, which of course we regard as a central problem with regard to the oceans, the coasts and oceans, including, as you said, the very important wetlands. If we work with the sectors and that they are fully engaged in the process, and most obviously the fishing sector, large and small, but also the consumers, the supply chains, similarly for shipping, similarly for all the other sectors that use the oceans. And so we've certainly wanted to be open and encourage inputs to the process, whether that's through providing submissions, reaching out through different consultations. I mentioned earlier the consultation we had, which was jointly organized with the workshop on voluntary commitments. And we're also organizing a whole series of parallel processes and events that will be linked to COP15 in Kunming. So there's a forum for business, forum for cities and local authorities, forum for indigenous peoples and local communities, and so on. We also are working with FAO and other organizations in terms of reaching out, for example, to the food and agricultural sectors, fisheries, but also land management more generally, of course, also been really important. And as you just mentioned yourself, Peter, to the UN Food Systems Summit, inviting those involved in the national level dialogues to contribute to the biodiversity agenda and vice versa. Of course, what we're trying to do is never enough, and we therefore, I repeat what I said earlier to call upon all those involved in this event here to help us in reaching out to all aspects of the oceans community as we move forward on the post-2020 framework. And just you mentioned, and I've tried to focus on those that are most relevant to the oceans, but of course, we will need to be engaging, for example, with finance. We're working with the multilateral development banks and with the other public banks who affect the type of investments that take place. So we're making additional efforts in that area, for instance. And finally, just to highlight, of course, the importance of getting support from people on the ground. I mean, in the end, whether we're talking about the land or whether we're talking about the oceans, if fisherfolk, if other local communities are not engaged, then we will not achieve implementation of the post-2020 framework. So let's setting the scene for implementation as well as for developing the framework right from the beginning.
Brilliant. Thank you, David. And just to remind again on Ocean's behalf that, we as terrestrial dwellers overlook the fact that, something like 97% of biodiversity on this planet is hosted by the ocean. So let's remember that as we proceed on our road to Lisbon, and we'll look forward to seeing you and contributing in Kunming. Peter Swazenski, can I turn to you on the question of adequate measuring of the health of the ocean? I think, this has particular relevance, obviously, for the UN Decade of Ocean Science, but also for what you're doing on acidification and deoxygenation and temperature as well. Do you think we have adequate measuring systems in place? Peter.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Thomson. So, as you so eloquently started us off today, I think we inherently need a healthy ocean to provide food, livelihoods, recreational opportunities, but on the flip side, for regulating global climate. But today we live in a world with more than 7 billion people, and more than half of us live very close to the coast. And so I think we urgently need new analytical techniques and tools and ways to present this information to guide how we can balance our needs, as you just mentioned, our terrestrial needs with the capacity of the ocean, the finite capacity of the ocean. As a general note, I think this is a very complicated question, but I do think we're moving in the right direction. I can give an example of Ben Halpert at Santa Barbara, and his colleagues have very nicely put together, for example, an ocean health index. And while there are limitations to this index, it does provide a systematic platform to assess the health of the ocean with a known set of public variables, or these 10 public goals and sub-goals that they have put into this. But I think we still have a lot of important tasks ahead. And as has been brought forward in this webinar, there are COVID-related limitations, there are funding-related limitations. And I think all of us can quickly come up with 50 or more key parameters or conditions that we need to describe the health of the ocean. But as we know now from ocean change, and as you just mentioned, none of these interact in a single way. They all act very complexly with one another. So deoxygenation and warming and ocean acidification are all very complicated, and they will be exacerbated by pollution. Pollution also happens in a complicated mixture. You hardly ever see only mercury, but it would be mercury with other heavy metals. And so getting the science right about ocean change and about this complicated interactions that ultimately affect the health of our oceans will become very important. But I think we're making important advances for the decade. So from an observational point of view, from the laboratory, as well as from just field observations. So to end this on kind of a positive note, through the 2030 agenda and even this Communities of Ocean action process, we're providing tools for stakeholders and member states to provide important information so they can report back on key metrics, be it ocean acidification, be it pollution, or any one of these communities of ocean actions that we've talked about today. So I think we are making important progress on an important path towards being able to address the health of the ocean. But certainly this will be a topic for discussion and debate for many, many years. Thank you. Back to you.
Many thanks, Peter. That's a very comprehensive answer. Thank you for that. I'm going to put the next question to Takahiro Nakamura, and I see that, you know, it's pretty much been covered already by what we've discussed. So Takahiro, feel free to just sort of wrap up the panel. You're the last panelist to speak, because we're going to move straight away from you to the two permanent representatives who are going to wrap up our webinar today. But if you'd like to quickly sum things up, the question is, what actions are being proposed for the protection and conservation of marine flora and fauna, particularly coral reefs, particularly in the light of increased ocean acidity and the dumping of chemical waste and other pollutants? Over to you, Takahiro, for a sum up.
Thank you very much. That you gave me a kind of really big task of summing up of our discussion today. I just would like to really group our needed action into the three group of actions. The first, making available the best science-based information to the stakeholders. This is very, very important. Quite a lot of unknown still exists on the coral reef functions or ecosystem functions or pollution. At the same time, making available best available science-based information is to the stakeholders in general is a very, very important first step. Second, we have to address the threats to the ecosystems. Those threats are coming from both land-based human activities and sea-based human activities. And the people on the land are also responsible for the degradation of the coastal and the marine environment ecosystem degradation. So linking our land-based economies and the land-based human activities with the marine and the coastal ecosystem is an important thing. In doing that, perhaps I would also really try to really say that sustainable consumption and the production approach is very, very important on the land-based activities and land-based economies. And the third category of the action is protection versus restoration. Under the diversity target and the post-2020, there's another discussion happening about setting a higher ambition on the protection of the marine areas. And then I think the countries will really move toward more and more on the protection side. At the same time, I also, as indicated in my presentation, that the restoration of the ecosystem is also giving more and more attention these days, and particularly addressing the climate change related issues and others. So I think the third category of action is the protection and restoration in this. And finally, I think many speakers mentioned about COVID-19. And then unfortunately, this the pandemic also gave quite a lot of changes to the human life and the consumption patterns and the production patterns. And we are really hoping that the world in the ocean community would bring back the pathway for the sustainable ocean back to the normal and the real sustainable manner, even after the COVID pandemic is getting into the recovery phase. Otherwise, the sustainability is somehow a little bit distorted by the COVID-19 pandemic. So just kind of one figure I would like to really show that the global plastic packaging market size is projected to grow from $902 billion in 2019 to $1,012 billion in 2021. This is associated with the more takeaway and the delivery containers made of plastics. So because of the COVID, that the people's consumption pattern has changed. And we are really hoping that in the BBB process, that we are going to bring back more in the sustainable pathways in the blue and the green recovery path. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Takahiro. Very thoughtful last comment there on the blue-green recovery and the takeaway industry, which I think, many of us are victim to. It really falls in that same category as discarded PPE in many cases. Look, I'm going to move quickly along now because we're bringing this to a close. I really want to thank the panelists. It was a great discussion. I really enjoyed it all the way through. So thank you for that. And thank you to your communities of ocean action that you lead. And I hope many are present to listen to what has been discussed on their behalf. Now, look, I won't be saying any more. So in giving those thanks, I also just want to reaffirm that this has been a very important meeting on the road to Lisbon, because the whole thing has been recorded. DESA is going to analyze all this together with me, and we'll give feedback to you all. So we're now delighted to have the permanent representatives of the co-hosts of the 2017 UN Ocean Conference with us today. I'm referring, of course, to Fiji and Sweden. And it's now my great pleasure to invite Her Excellency the Ambassador Anna-Karin Ennerström, the permanent representative of Sweden to the United Nations, to deliver her closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Peter. And I'd like to thank everyone that has contributed to this really, really rich and topical discussion today. Very important indeed. And the Oceans Conference in 2017, and of course, Peter, you were very much involved in that conference, raised the profile of the multiple and diverse threats to the world's oceans that affect people's lives, as well as the importance of healthy oceans to sustainable development and to the achievements of all SDGs. Let me at this stage make 5 quick points. First, on the voluntary commitments. And as we have heard today, the voluntary commitments have been a success. The commitments reflect the synergies inherent in and among all SDGs. And I'd like very much to agree with others on the need to identify and to build on such interlinkages, as well as the Paris Agreement and the biodiversity framework. But even if the commitments collectively have furthered the attainment of SDG 14, none of the 4 SDG 14 targets that matured in 2020 were met. Additionally, most of the other ocean targets also are lagging behind. Second, in the wake of COVID-19, it is important that we pursue a holistic approach and build back better, greener, and bluer. And the small island development states remain a special case with regard to sustainable development in view of their unique and particular challenges. Third, on the importance of ocean science and enhanced ocean knowledge. The decade of ocean science offers a unique opportunity to congregate around common goals for the ocean science we need for the oceans we want. Science and innovation will also take the spotlight at the 2020 Ocean Conference. We need more commitments from the scientific community, academia, and philanthropic organizations. Fourth, on the need to step up our actions as we are now in a decade of action. Sweden has raised its ambition in relation to SDG 14. This is reflected in our development cooperation and our recently adopted strategy for stepped up action on biodiversity on land and below water. Sweden's implementation of our voluntary contributions is also on track. Furthermore, as been mentioned, Sweden has financially supported UN DESA and communities of ocean action. I look forward to the upcoming reports. They will contribute substantially to the preparatory process in the lead up to the second UN Ocean Conference in Lisbon. For the 2020 Ocean Conference, we need to showcase good examples and focus on scaling up success stories and building on successful partnership. We need to increase regional cooperation while not lose sight of accelerating implementation on the ground. Here, local expertise and indigenous knowledge are important. Also, where we don't make enough progress, we must ramp up other means of governance and make complementary efforts. So I would like to support those that have been arguing for starting negotiations on a global binding agreement to tackle plastic pollution. Lastly, and as many of the speakers have said, the communities of ocean action are inclusive of all stakeholders. Voluntary commitments made are mutually reinforcing and would be key in accelerating implementation of the 2030 agenda on the ground. As my final words, I would like to encourage many more voluntary contributions to be made on the road towards Lisbon. I thank you very much.
Yes, thank you for that clarion call for more voluntary commitments, both on the road to Lisbon and when we get there. Can I just say, folks, for everybody listening, Sweden's commitment to this whole process from before the 2017 conference, during and in the wake of, has been exemplary. And I'm sure they are going to be in Lisbon and ready to hand over to Portugal and Kenya. And now to the from the shores of the Baltic all the way down to the shores of the South Pacific Ocean, it's my great pleasure to give the last word in our gathering today to His Excellency, the Ambassador of Fiji, the Permanent Representative of Fiji to the United Nations, Satendra Prasad. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you very much, colleagues, for giving me this last slot. And what a wonderful morning it has been. I've been with you throughout, except for brief interruptions, but it was a remarkable journey. I thought about what you thought voluntary commitments could help us achieve, and absolutely, as Anna Karina said, were the right things and how far we could go. And this is in how far we could go in terms of the targets we are lagging behind. I think it's also absolutely the right thing, but it is perhaps also why we are lagging is also symptomatic of one other thing. And I will take a few moments to elaborate my thinking. SDG 14 is the most underfunded part of the SDG storyline. And second, also, it is potentially the most transformative part of the SDG storyline. And the disconnect between the two is startling. And this morning's discussion, I thank you very much, Peter and DESA, for bringing all the pieces together. And it's remarkable that all the different networks through which you are tracking voluntary commitments were having a conversation together, and they were seeing the interlinkages, the different parts of the story on biodiversity, oceans, desertification. We are having conversations together, and they were seeing the interlinkages. And those of you who have cross-cutting oversight across the pieces, Food Summit and oceans, etc., you are doing the right thing and creating the linkages. Out of linkages will come additionality, and I think out of linkages will come pace, and out of additionality will come new ideas on how we can overcome and get the bridges. And that's truly transformative. So this was a fantastic morning, and I congratulate everybody for that. Now, my second part is that we are now staring at a decade of lost development, a decade in which we are not necessarily going to go the SDG path, but many countries, as we heard yesterday in the financing for development piece, are in the survival mode, and more will be in the survival mode. And so we have to think very hard about how do we use oceans as part of that narrative and going forward in building back better, in building forward, in building green. How do we elevate and position the ocean storyline much better? So I'm making 2 or 3 suggestions to this great community, of which I'm a part as well. First is that in the next decade, we should be increasingly also talking about ocean sustainable blue economy in terms of jobs, livelihoods, health, hunger, and the type of real knotty problems that we will be confronting more and more with greater intensity throughout the decade, because this is where our public policy makers, our governments, and the big decision makers are focused on these issues. So we need to create a narrative that speaks in that way. So to the community of actions, I'm posing 2 or 3 questions to you. Are the commitments reflected in national budgets of your countries that you are working with, or in regional organizations? Are the commitments reflected in being captured in the stimulus packages that are beginning to be announced? And that is the only piece of money or new money that is in play. Are these initiatives being locked into substantive programming, financial programming across MDBs and IFIs, etc., so that it is part of that story? And precisely what I'm saying is that this is a great opportunity to be asking for a blue stimulus. There's 5 to 7 trillion at play already. What portion of that is blue? What portion of that is oceans? And this is the job, I think, of this community to bring the helpful ideas into that space. What is the so that's the stimulus piece. The second piece is on the recovery piece. What is the role of oceans in the recovery part? So when we are recovering from the immediate urgency, where does oceans feature in terms of creating jobs, livelihoods, ecosystem restoration, creating livelihoods, protecting livelihoods, increasing incomes, and so on, getting that narrative right as well. Lots and lots of discussions, and both Peter, you and I have been part of many discussions about the private sector, and there's very positive development, and this is certainly another piece where oceans and private sector needs to be connected much more substantively, because more opportunities will be coming from that side. So to this community, I'm also posing this. And my final 1 minute, and I will log off, is that at Lisbon, I hope that we can get a new narrative for oceans for the next decade and beyond. I think it should be a narrative something broader on life on planet. This is what we are fundamentally talking about. It is not a siloed piece. It's a firmly integrated piece, and that we are getting 50, 60-year type of visioning on life planets. At the micro level, when world opinion then interacts with the narrative that comes out of Lisbon, I would like, women in coastal communities in Bangladesh to be able to understand where is the ocean's microfinance part, that communities across the Pacific can see where is the oceans and gender equality part, that the smart folks going to school can look at where's the oceans and data analytics and blue data analytics. Where is the blue SMEs part of that puzzle? Where are the blue innovation hubs? Where are the blue music, art, culture, and traditional knowledge? That piece, and and where do you go to school for blue public policy if you want to become like Peter and influence global public policy? Is there a shortcut way of acquiring this type of knowledge pieces? So great expectation. What a fantastic morning it has been. Congratulate you, Peter, DESA, and all your colleagues for very rich interventions. I also look forward to reading the report of the findings, etc. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for that, Satendra, and also for anchoring the sustainable blue economy and the blue-green recovery into the real outcome of today's discussions. That's where we're headed. Look, on behalf of UNDESA, on behalf of the governments of Portugal and Kenya, I want to thank you all for participating. And as Satendra has just said to us all, what a great couple of hours it's been. So I won't hold any of you up any further, but I do want to say not only that I'll see you in Lisbon, but I'm going to see you in those way stations along the way that we have mentioned on the road to Lisbon. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Maria. Thanks, Chin.